Listen, I shit you not. I had to go out and buy 64 gigabytes of RAM for this piece of shit computer just so that I could finish this video. It has been an eventful quarter, between me acquiring some machinery, releasing a game, and making a metric assload of progress. There's a lot to unpack. So, let's get right into it. First things first, the top most exciting thing that I want to share with you is I got an embroidery machine. Listen, I'm a millennial. I can fucking forget about owning a house in Canada in my lifetime. Our glorious government is so obsessed with cutting off peepees off little Timmies and gluing them onto little Debbies that they forgot we can't fucking survive on virtual signaling alone. I'm sure that when we're collectively freezing our asses off in the dead of winter, living in a box, sucking dick so we can afford that property tax, the first thing that will come to mind is how progressive our government has been. So, I decided to spend my money on something that at least somehow has the potential of making me some sort of an income. I have seen this machine all of twice in my entire lifetime. First time must have been a good decade ago when we were celebrating someone's birthday at Eaton Center in downtown Toronto, and I noticed this branded cap shop with this rustic Asian dude operating this machine. Embroidery thread weaving in and out, zigzagging all over the place, slowly watching that design come to life, and I thought this was the coolest shit ever. I was thinking that since Child of Ether seems to be the project that gets the most attention, it would probably be a good idea to start thinking about merchandising for my various endeavors. That's when Google must have already had pointed its brain rays into my face, because the very next day I started seeing ads for all sorts of wild crap. One of which happened to be this embroidery machine. The memory of the rustic Asian from the depth of my teenage years had somehow emerged, and I could have sworn I heard him say, "You break, you buy." Although that might be related to a different memory. In any case, I took out a business loan and found a distributor with the most enthusiasm to answer all my questions about the magical world of embroidery, and ordered the machine from then. Now, what's that, you say? Why did I spend 5K of borrowed money when I could have just found a shop to embroider those hats for me instead? Shut up. Okay, to be completely honest, it simply felt right. There's no more accurate excuse I can offer. I just wanted to do it myself. I am no stranger to dipping my toes into all sorts of arts and crafts. Between aluminum CNC milling, embedded hardware prototyping, silicone and plastics experiments, and fiber laser engravings, it just seemed to me like trying to do it myself would just feel a heck of a lot more satisfying than outsourcing it to someone else. And to be fair, there is nothing wrong with outsourcing. I simply find taking part in this sort of stuff just as personally fulfilling as game development or music. Besides, between the various game development projects, the various YouTube channels, our gaming YouTube channel for Pete's sake, my DJing gig, and the Eurorack panel making endeavor, there is no shortage of opportunities where embroidered merchandise would be an appropriate fit. It would also certainly help with the margins. But I'll worry about that later when I've made my money back to cover the cost of the machine. My parental units were not amused when they saw me dragging this thing into the house, because when I told them that I had ordered an embroidery machine, they must have expected we be a tabletop thing no larger than an average computer tower, and not the towering behemoth that the infernal thing actually turned out to be. Oh god, and I was considering to buy a two-headed one. Thank Jesus I decided not to. Needless to say, there were a lot of opinions being voiced that day, and as usual, anytime I acquire a high-caliber piece of machinery like this, I get the standard issue packet of questions from my mother on when am I going to graduate from my bachelor lifestyle and grant her some grandkids. However, it all boiled down to me making a wager with my father that by Christmas this year, I will have made at least $1,000 in net sales solely from this machine, before he makes the same amount from his print shop sales. The loser has to buy the winner a nice bottle of cognac. Now, I'm not gonna bore you with all the gory details. I have, however, spent some time trying out some experiments, and boy, let me tell you, embroidery is a medium like no other. I created a couple of monochromatic illustrations, a la Child of Ether style, with the intention of getting them embroidered onto some hats and shirts, only to find out very quickly that tiny details don't translate very well onto fabric and thread, and therein lies my first obstacle. When designing the merch, I have to seriously consider the scale of all the details. Granted, if the embroidery was large enough, say for a shirt, the full-size shirt, it wouldn't really be that big of a deal. However, because we're starting off with something as innocuous as caps, that might be a bit of a problem. Now, of course, one could argue that instead of embroidery, I could have gone with screen printing, where a printed image is heat transferred onto a shirt. But to tell you the truth, it wasn't the printed shirts that captivated my attention all those years ago, and I generally consider embroidered designs to be a much more impressive than mere printed screen transfers. For something like that, I might actually just outsource. So while I'm figuring out the inner workings of embroidery-compatible artwork design, I decided to start off with baby steps and simply embroider the game's title in nice simple satin stitch. These hats will be available on my studio web store, eisenstadtstudio.com, along with matching Godot Engine hats, idea courtesy of the users from the Godot Engine subreddit, 30% of gross profits from which will be contributed back to the beastly engine that allowed me to effortlessly express my game ideas. I'm also thinking about doing socks, simply because someone on Twitter showed explicit interest, and I just so happen to have the hardware. Now then, why don't we get into the nitty-gritty meat and potatoes and start off this progress report with Dreadtail. I'm going to be focusing a lot more of my time on the Dreadtail project in the coming months, and mainly this is because I can't wait to wrap it up so I can get back to working on Atomicon. I had a gentleman who had reached out to me a few months back, expressed interest in the Atomicon project. This gentleman is a 3D modeler and texturer, and what he had in mind is pretty much the same sort of Fallout-inspired post-apocalyptic project as Atomicon was. And at this point, we got into contact, we talked for a bit, and it really seemed to make more sense where instead of having both of us work on two individual Fallout-inspired post-apocalyptic survival games, why not join forces and try to build this thing out in turn? I have extensive programming experience, music writing, sound effects creation, modeling, texturing, and this gentleman has his experience in modeling and texturing and asset creation, so why not? Makes sense. The only problem is that I have extending commitments that I have to finish. A whole bunch of projects that I've started that had a lot more effort put into them, a lot more work, a lot more time, and it just doesn't make sense to shelve them just so that I can hop over and switch to Atomicon and have fun with that. So after some back and forth, what we decided to do is instead focus our effort on this project, get it done, get it out of the door, put it on Steam, and once that's out of the way, we can hop over to Atomicon and have our fun. It also kind of makes sense from the development standpoint because a lot of my projects are playgrounds where I get to experiment with different mechanics, adding different features, because next projects would be able to make use of those features and I don't have to spend a lot of time wondering how am I going to implement this. What I'm doing here is trying to figure out how to get Godot Engine to procedurally generate the navigation mesh for the entire map. I mentioned this before, this game is supposed to be randomly generated, not procedurally generated, randomly generated, which is a lot simpler to do than procedural generation. The randomness comes from the scattering of different locations and different destroyed buildings, different derelict spaces, and different placements for the bunker chunks that the player is supposed to discover as they go through the forest, through the swamps. It is supposed to create, well, not only replayability aspect to it, but also make sure that every experience is ever so slightly a little bit different from the previous one. Now, because there's going to be hostile enemies that have to chase the player, that have to be able to navigate this environment, I had to figure out how to dynamically generate the navigation mesh within the game while it is running. And Godot Engine actually has a lot of really cool tools that help you to do just that. One of those tools is the fact that the engine is capable of live generating the navigation mesh. However, it took almost like 2 minutes in order for it to generate one on the scale that is in the game. All the terrain, all the buildings, everything had to be analyzed, and that takes quite a fair amount of time. What's cool about the approach that Godot Engine offers is that you can actually delegate the generation of the terrain onto a separate thread. So for those of you who don't know, game developers can choose to take advantage of something called multi-threading, which is where they take some sort of a heavy command that takes a lot of processing power to perform, and they execute that command on a separate thread on your processor. So it quite literally creates a parallel instance or within the operating system, which says, hey, don't use the main CPU for this, because if you do, it will stutter. Use instead the one of the secondary cores to perform this calculation. And when I said that the Godot Engine actually started for 1.5 minutes creating the nav mesh, I really mean like it paused, like you could not play the game at all. Now, there is another game that technically does that, and by that I mean pause for an extensive amount of time, and that is Subnautica. When you launch a new game, or when you launch, technically even load file, it goes through a pretty extensive loading process, which takes a good, I think, minute more or less, a little bit less. But what's happening during that process is it's loading all the assets, it's loading all the textures, materials, resources, loading all the code base, any type of data structures, all of the heavy stuff. And a lot of the stuff is usually textures and maps and shaders. So technically, I could say that when you start a new game, the process of procedurally generating the navigation mesh is pretty much a part of that loading process. It's gonna look right. You're sitting in the loading screen. In the meantime, the game is actually placing you in the real world with the black screen in front of you, or some sort of a loading screen in front of you. And Godot Engine is just busy in the background generating that navigation mesh based on all the randomly placed assets all over the map. Which works, but I kind of wish it was a little bit better, or there was some sort of a better solution. And the better solution is to put that generation into a separate thread. So the idea in the game is that when you start the new game, right away you are not going to get any enemy encounters. Doesn't make sense. It's a little too early. You gotta, work the players into it. You gotta give them a second to acclimate with the environment. It is, after all, randomly generated. Every time you start the game, the locations aren't the same. But the navigation mesh could be then calculated while the player is already playing the game in the background. So that, I thought, was a really cool feature of the engine, and it does solve that particular problem. It took me a little bit of Googling around to figure out if it's even possible to procedurally generate the terrain, which was possible, but the answer was buried somewhere deep into the dark crevices of the web. It was, I don't think the function at the time was even commented in the documentation. So it's one of those things where I know a guy who knows a guy who can tell you the answer, but the engine offers it, so I guess that should work out just fine. This solves the problem with the stutter, and we get our navigation mesh based on all the random locations. Speaking of the enemies, around this time I had actually played Soma for the first time. Now, I have watched Markiplier play Soma way back when Soma came out, but this was the first time me actually experiencing it firsthand. And there was a particular cool effect that the developers had used on the enemies, where if the player looked at the enemies for too long, the screen space, specifically around the enemies, would start distorting itself. And I thought that was a really cool effect, because it's like this localized distortion. So I went ahead and tried to recreate the same effect, which, to be honest, is pretty trivial. All you have to do is create some sort of a surface that is overlaying on top of your gameplay, and then you simply take the rendered frame using the material editor or shader editor or visual editor, you just take the rendered frame, plaster it as a texture over that surface, and start distorting it however you'd like. Now, the key to getting the distortions to actually appear where the enemies are were quite simply by making a separate texture of grayish rectangles, and the darkness or the lightness of the rectangles will determine in which direction the pixels will be offset. And anytime an enemy would be created, the enemy also created a cluster of those rectangles within the player's viewport, within the player's vision, and it simply placed it on top of the screen space where the enemy is being displayed. So if the enemy is in the top left corner, the rectangles would appear in the top left corner. The Godot Engine's camera class actually offers a lot of really cool features for doing both forward and backward projection, which means it allows you to calculate if you click somewhere on the 2D space of the screen, it allows you to figure out where in 3D world that click has occurred. And the same thing in the opposite direction. If you have a three-dimensional object in the world, it allows you to say where on the screen it is located. If you're trying to visualize that effect, think the weapon stats in Borderlands, when there's a box above the weapon and it tells you how powerful the weapon is, what specials it has, what's the cost, and etc, etc. That is pretty much done using reverse projection or projection. You take the object in 3D space, you ask the camera that is looking at that object, hey, where on the screen am I located? And then you get a nice little vector 2 coordinate, and then you can just plaster that stat box, whatever you want. In my case, I made a whole bunch of little grayish rectangles position themselves in that space, and then I took the viewport within which all those rectangles were located, and I used that viewport as a texture, as a distortion texture within the main screen. So to be honest, pretty straightforward solution. And I actually used visual shaders to achieve this because I actually find the node-based programming system to be absolutely perfect for shaders, not so much for core programming. I still think the blueprints in Unreal Engine are an absolute atrocity, but for shaders, for anything visual, just like Blender has the node-based system for their shaders and materials, absolutely fantastic. And I wish they would focus quite a bit more on that, which they did with Godot 4. They've added a whole bunch of really cool additions, and I wish they would just continue working on it and adding all sorts of features. Instance-based shaders, that's the feature that's going to be super cool, allowing you to have the one single shader, but have them not share the uniforms and the properties. So you have 3 or 4 or 5 objects that have the same shader, but they all can manipulate that shader in different ways, which unfortunately when you're doing shader instancing is not a thing just yet. Next up, I started experiencing a very weird performance issue. Something was majorly screwing up my in-game frame rate. So it's something that I have technically experienced before, and I totally forgot about how I fixed it initially until I started using the debugger, the profiler, which actually is actually capable of telling you what performance, what sort of processes are eating up your performance. Was it the resource loading? Was it the texture pages swapping too much? Was it the physics process? And what I had come to a conclusion is that my frame rate would dip every time a new enemy would spawn into the level. So the enemies are attacking my hardware. It took an unbelievably stupid long time to figure out what it was, but the cause was so dumb. And here's what the cause actually is. I use a terrain plugin called Zillion's Terrain plugin. I believe that's the gentleman's name. It's a really cool plugin because it handles terrain with varying levels of LOD, which means that at no point in time are you just rendering one ginormous terrain mesh. Instead, the terrain that's far, far away is rendered using just a few polygons. The terrain that's closer to you is rendered with a lot of polygons. So that particular part was a huge performance boost to any level that has like a giant chunk of terrain, and this game just so happens to have a giant chunk of terrain. Now, the issue is that there is a node in Godot engine called area node. And the way the area node works is that it is capable of detecting other areas or physics objects like static bodies, rigid bodies, and kinematic bodies, which in Godot 4 are called something different. But here's the problem. For some reason, and this is only a speculation, but for some reason, Zillion's terrain treats each and every triangle of the terrain as a separate collision shape, which may be the way he's managed to make the terrain behave the way it does, where it's technically a dynamic terrain. You hypothetically could edit it in real time, although there is no such feature as far as I know in it yet. So I'm pretty sure that because the terrain uses LOD, the collision shape also has to update itself as the terrain updates. When the things going further away from you become lower detail and things that are coming at you become higher detail. I can't confirm that for sure, but I have a suspicion that every single triangle is treated as a separate shape because I have an area node inside of the player that is pretty big. And the job of that area is to enable and disable collision shapes of all the different trees so that you don't have like 200 collisions for objects that are nowhere near you. There's a lot of trees in this game, like a massive amount of trees. And they're not made using multi-mesh because there's no collisions with multi-mesh. I really wish there were, but there's not. For every single tree, which there's only like 3 or 5, I had to generate a separate simplified collision shape. Very simple, but I had to do it for each tree separately. I had to reduce their poly count, I had to reduce their resolution, and then turn them into some sort of a more or less manageable collision shape that doesn't treat every tiny twig as a separate shape. The problem is that, well, you have 300 trees or 500 trees all over the map. That's 500 collision shapes. We can't have that many collision shapes. So the system I've made is every single tree and every single collision shape is disabled by default. And then this area node around the player is detecting entry and exits for all the trees. And when it detects those entries and exits, it ends up messing around with the tree collisions and visibility as well, which visibility technically could have been done by a shader, but I didn't know that at the time. So I just made it visible and invisible. Now, because that area node is so huge, I think that every single triangle of the terrain was being reported as a separate collision, and basically the area node was just going nuts. It says, 200 triangles have just entered my area. Let's go ahead and process the signals for all of them. And of course, you can probably imagine that that did absolutely horrendous things to the performance. So instead, I put the terrain on a separate collision layer, and the area node does not scan that collision layer, so that's how I fixed the problem. Cue in, half a year later when I started implementing basic enemy navigation and AI, and guess what? I needed to make sure that the enemies know where the nearby trees are. It's not as big of an area, but it's still there. So I totally forgot that that area would be detecting the terrain again, because it crossed over to the collision shape, to collision layer. So now, every time a new enemy joins the ranks, every time the new enemy appears behind a tree, my performance tanks. It took me a little while to figure that out, but that was the solution. And anybody who's going to be using Zillion's terrain, if you have some ginormous area nodes that are moving around, keep in mind that those area nodes will be detecting each and every single collision shape, every single triangle of that terrain all the time. So keep that in mind. I moved on to a little bit of prop making. In this particular case, I have made a tape recorder. The tape recorder's job, of course, is going to be to play back magnetic tapes, which will contain audio recordings of various conversations between the key characters whom the player kind of follows throughout their journey, and the tapes will also contain some certain key assets and key components that progress the story forward, as well as grant player access to new areas which means that it is going to be a pretty key component. Now, these tape recorders are going to be spread out all across the map. I think I'm actually even going to make them randomly appear in certain locations, and it would be randomly chosen which locations they appear in. So in one Let's Play, let's say you can have the tape recorder appear in the commissary, but in another Let's Play, it's not appearing in the commissary, it's going to be in the bunks. Or it's going to be in the office of the general, or it's going to be in the science office. And there's going to be a few of them, but they will be randomly distributed. Thus, again, trying to improve on the replayability and making sure that every single person who plays the game does not have the same exact experience. I took a little bit of time going through the notes on the story, trying to organize them into the Siren narrative builder, trying to figure out what is connected to what, just trying to clean up house and make sense of the entire story. This game is structured after a pretty standard approach of distributing objectives between your obstacles. There's a single main goal. That goal requires 3 or 4 objectives to be fulfilled. In order to achieve those objectives, you have to fill some smaller objectives and overcome some smaller obstacles, and that's how you basically pad out a whole puzzle type game. All my notes started in Trello, but with the type of game where you have a branching objective tree, it is becoming very difficult to keep track of what is the causation of what, or what kind of objectives lead into what kind of consequence. So it actually made sense for me to move over all of the major objectives and all of the major obstacles into Siren, which can in turn be used to organize your causation and consequence map of your entire story. Next, there is a particular central location to the game, which is the silo, which of course carries some very important discoveries for the player to unravel. And this particular location, I think, is going to be stationary from playthrough to playthrough. It's kind of a complex location. It's got a lot of props that you would have to walk around. And I think having some sort of a central landmark would make it, I would say, a good choice for a game that has a pretty large map, and potentially we might even be able to implement some multiplayer into it, co-op, because that's kind of the original idea for this game. Survive the swamps with your buddies. So having a central location, my character is dying over there from thirst. The central location, always being in the middle of the map, would provide well, your good old standard landmark, something that every player can always return to and say, okay, I'm here, where do I go? And then the players will say, okay, take out your compass and go north, east, southwest, yada yada yada. Another prop idea came to mind, a server rack. It's a prop idea that I basically borrowed from Portal 2, where you get into the back offices and start seeing all the science equipment. Man, every time I see old retro equipment from like 50s, 60s, it just looks so darn cool. So I wanted to make a server rack prop, but server racks usually come in all sorts of varieties. And this is one of those cases where if I'm gonna get a lot of server racks, if I have to make a lot of server racks, that's gonna take a fair amount of time. And again, we're trying to think smart about it. So we're trying to make it so that we don't spend days on just a single type of prop and where we have the rest of the game to make. So I decided to make a procedural server rack using a little bit of 3D modeling, texturing, and GGScript code. In reality, a server rack is a pretty simple model to make. All it is the rack mount itself. Then you have the individual slotted computers that you slide in and out of the rack. Of course, you don't have to do that in the game, but the basic shapes for those racks are basically thick case, thin case. That's basically it. On each one of those cases, you would find a number of switches, dials, lights, or some sort of indicators. If I were to hard model each and every single one of those dials onto the case itself, then you would see repetition quite easily. So once again, we went with the procedural approach and we simply modeled the light, the indicator, the dial, the switch separately, and then we just used a little bit of GGScript code to instance a bunch of mesh instances, assign them the geometry of the switches, the lights, the dials, and then distribute them across the facing panel of the case with randomness in mind. After we get the random dials, now we have to make the random cases. So again, it was just the same code, except instead of instancing the little dials, it was just us instancing the cases themselves. Distribute them randomly across the rack and done. What would usually have taken us maybe a week had now taken us only like what, an hour or so. So the power of a little bit of coding really goes a long way. Now, unfortunately, at this point, I started noticing something weird about my computer. It started crashing a little too often, and I didn't like that one bit. I do backups, don't get me wrong, I do backups, but I don't want the rest of my computer going under. So I had actually ended up taking a moment, taking a trip to Canada Computers, and it was my impression that it might have been the power supply, because the power supply in this computer is old. Like I had stripped that power supply from the carcass of my Core 2 quad machine, and I unceremoniously plugged it into this one, and it worked. But at the same time, it's like, technically by lifespan of power supplies, it's a grandfather by this point. But just for good measure, I had also I had also purchased a new hard drive, and I had quickly transferred the files from one hard drive to the new one, and the crashing has stopped. So it was a dying hard drive. Guess which power supply is still powering this entire system? Help! Kill me! So, disaster averted, but just in case, I still perform my backups after every single development session, so we're good. More prop making. This is where I started putting together some reminiscence of the scaffolding, some of the level geometry for the main area, so to speak, that surrounds the silo. There's supposed to be some equipment, a couple of these towers scattered all over. I have a particular image in my head where it's a science experiment hastily put together, so there's a certain amount of disarray, cables everywhere, wires everywhere. It's just an absolute mess. Just gives me shivers thinking about it, but it's basically like a derelict science space, so to speak. Of course, since there is a silo, the player also has to be able to interact with the silo. It's kind of a part of the main story. So I got to modeling the control panel, something really old and really rounded and really rusty, that the player would have to interact with in order to open the main silo. This is where my fascination with the 50s technology and the Art Deco design had crept up a little bit, and the entire panel basically looks like some sort of a submarine console. I believe I actually looked at reference photos of submarine dashboards for this one. Not only is there a console, there's also supposed to be a pair of keys. The player's supposed to be able to find those keys by following the clues they uncover throughout the story. The keys were put together, textured, and then turned into inventory items. And for the key twisting animation, I actually just decided to use the in-engine animation player to give it a little bit of rotation and have a couple of curves that make the rotation look a little bit more interesting. Data Engine's animation players, at the same time, surprisingly flexible and surprisingly limiting. One particular thing I wish they would do is add more controls from tools like Blender, where, for example, if you select multiple keyframes, you can press the S key to scale, and it will just scale all the keyframes back and forth. I find that the default distance of the Bezier curves, the two handles you get, so you get a keyframe, you get two handles for the Bezier curves, and you can move them around to adjust the curves. I find that the distance of the default curve is way too far apart. So if you, let's say, putting together the keyframes, the key poses for the animation, and then turning everything into Bezier curves, it just destroys everything. Those handles are way too far apart. They absolutely have to be brought at least maybe a third or even a quarter closer to the frames. And this became a problem in another project that I'm covering in this video too. Maybe even having some sort of a tool like the proportional editing tool in Blender might be really, really useful here. Fingers crossed they've got somebody on the team who's specifically focusing on this. I honestly, if we can get it to the point where you can animate a lot of the stuff in Godot effortlessly, that's just going to be a cherry on top, which is technically already happening. I have been using the animation player in quite a lot of conditions, and there's certain places where you can't really rely on it. Like, you have to work with more professional tools. And yes, I know there's going to be, you know, Godot developers, so like, if you need something more specific, then use the tool specifically designed for it. Man, it's almost there. Just add those two things and it will be awesome. A particular challenge with this console was making the individual elements light up when the player interacts with various components. Now, in hindsight, it might have been easier if I were to just export each and every display as a separate mesh and then given them a separate material and then just control them from within that material. It would have been a heck of a lot simpler, but I don't know, I guess I wanted to torture myself. So one material it is, and now within that one material, I have 3 separate labels, actually 5 separate labels that needed to light up independently. Thankfully, using a little bit of visual shader and creating a couple of texture maps that have black and white regions, isolating certain locations, adding other locations, and then doing a little bit of additive blending, or I think multiplication blending, allowed me to have one single material with 5 different uniforms that controlled the brightness of 5 different light up zones on this texture. Kind of a pain in the ass, but we got there eventually. More prop making. This one was for the audio system that's supposed to be scattered across the main testing ground. Basically an old-timey speaker design. It ties into the story, into the main puzzle the player needs to take care of, and there could even be cases where if the player chooses to, let's say, play a tape in that central location, the sound is going to come out of those speakers rather than coming out of maybe the tiny speaker of the tape player. On one hand, it's redundant. On another hand, I find it really cool. Like, anytime you have old technology coming back to life, I'm like, that's so cool. Next up was a little bit of everything, just kind of doing a carpet bomb of various tasks and various assets. We made a couple of concrete slabs that we can distribute all over the map to create regions of the bunker, or technically the floor part of it. A little bit of texture handling, a little bit of prop making, the stairs, the platforms, all sorts of minute stuff. Around this point, I started working on piecing together all of the different props that go into you interfacing with the main console, with a nuclear silo console, and I realized that a lot of the things here actually aren't powered. It doesn't make sense. Why are they operating without any power? So I decided to create a tiny little prop, basically a service lamp that is located above a fuse box, and I specifically made it into a separate object so that A, I could reuse it in other locations, and B, I can place it selectively only above certain fuse boxes. The job of this service lamp is to quite literally communicate if there is power. And also, the location of the fuse box was actually in a slightly inconveniently dark place where you couldn't really tell everything. So placing a lamp at that location not only illuminates the space, but also communicates to the player if they've popped in the batteries correctly and if there's power to the console. After several hours of linking various nodes together, providing all the export variables and all the references to all the different nodes around, it was finally time to get this whole thing tested. The procedure for this particular puzzle, for this obstacle, is quite simple. You have to provide power for the console. You also then have to provide power to the silo itself, because the giant silo isn't going to be powered by a couple of 24-volt batteries. So by story design, the entire silo is powered by a number of decommissioned truck engines. The angry cursing engineer who's going to be constantly complaining about stuff, his job was to put together some sort of a power source to power the silo. And the silo is basically, he just said, screw it, if you guys are not going to let me in on the project, I'm going to take 3 trucks, I'm going to order to decommission them, and then you're going to have to deal with the repercussions of not having enough trucks in your inventory. So the player will have to scour around the waste, scour around the swamps, locating old cars, tractor equipment, gas canisters, any sort of source of gas. They'll have to collect that gas or siphon it into canisters and then bring those canisters over to the central location so they can dunk it in and finally get their generators, their truck engines working, generating power and feeding the silo. So that's one piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle is, of course, providing the keys. You have to locate those keys, which involves a certain prop hunt of a sort, following the clues, following the footsteps, and that will lead the player to the 2 keys, which are required for the console. Player has those conditions. Everything is set. They press a button, silo opens up. Next part of the story begins. The last bit of progress I put on this project was working with a voice actress who has been an absolute treasure find. She has an absolutely phenomenal voice that fit the main protagonist perfectly, and it's not just the voice, it's the delivery. She was able to nail the character type, and it's absolutely phenomenal. I'm not going to show it to you yet because I want you to experience the game and her voice acting in the final product, but it absolutely blew my mind. She's actually doing a couple of characters across multiple projects. She's going to be here, and she's also going to be in the Arteg Rise project, voicing the one of the characters in the early access story component. So I'm super excited. If there's one thing that I really want to make sure that these games have is that they have good voice acting. There are so many games that did not choose to go with voice acting. Indie games, right? I mean, budget constraints is one thing, yes, but at the same time, even a little bit of voice acting goes a long way. Like, you have to try really hard to do such bad voice acting that you cannot use it in the game. So I'm really excited, really happy to work with her more. So cool stuff. This concludes all the progress I have made on the Dreadtail project. So why don't we move on to the next one? Child of Ether. Yeah, it's this one. Character's still dying of hunger. Somebody feed him. Go to my Patreon. Started this session progress with a little bit of prop making. I put together a little silo, silo door technically. It's supposed to be a location that the player stumbles upon as they are scavenging for stuff in the level, and it's realistically the first time that I've spent texturing solely in Blender. I usually tend to export props from Blender to Substance Painter, and I use Substance Painter's tools to paint, hand paint everything. There's supposed to be some outline work, and I find the Substance Painter creates the outlines a little too cleanly, so I tend to hand paint a lot of the edges. Once again, the animation was done in Godot Engine because it's an animation of a lid opening. I mean, come on. Do I really need to rig this thing and animate in Blender? Fairly simple stuff. Just use a bunch of basic curves. Thank you, Godot developers. Make the thing go, and then we're good to go. Now, it was around this time that I started doing standardizing for my door scripts. I believe I had 3 door versions at this point. One was a door that is quite literally baked into the protagonist's house. The second door was some sort of like a generic opening and closing door that doesn't really take you to another level. It's just an in-world prop that you can quite literally see the other side of. And third one was this one, which technically acted like the door to the protagonist's house because it actually transitions to another scene. But I can't really reuse the door to the protagonist's house because it is kind of hard-coded with the animation of the entire house. So either I make a third door, or I decide to do what I always do and try to create as much of a modular system for this as possible. And this kind of led me to basically stripping away all 3 doors and then making one that can either be internal, external, or one that's baked into another object. Took a little bit of work, but it will be good in the long run because we don't have 3 different code bases that we have to update, provided I say, oh, you know what? I want to add some functionality to the door system. Well, now you go through the 3 doors or however many doors I'd have at that point and reprogram each and every type. So Modular programming for the win. Next up, I decided to take on a little bit of water, and there are 3 reasons for it. First of all, water, come on. It looks good. Second of all, fishing. This is a survival game after all. So I did want to add fishing to the game. So you're not going to be fishing a lot in sands, although that's a cool game idea. And third reason being that I actually wanted to explore more of underwater settings in this game as well. So you gotta have a good water texture, good water material for that, and that's what led me to putting together this little water material. It's comprised out of a number of texture files that are overlaying, blending, and being offset at different speeds using a little bit of visual shader magic. Now, I actually started this particular material using just pure shader code, but I quickly realized that there's a particular effect that I didn't know how to implement using shader code, and that was the edge fading, or the proximity fading for the water. Essentially, it's an effect where when the water gets close to another mesh, it fades away. Like, for example, water that's really close to the shoreline, that's basically overlapping the shoreline at that point, would have to fade away. Otherwise, you have this very ugly clipping happening between the water and the land. You can quite literally see the seam where the land is covered by the soil. So I wanted to have that fading effect, which is a built-in feature of a standard Godot material, but I didn't know how to implement it in shader code. So what I did is I set up that shader material, set up the values for the fade, and then Godot Engine gives you a really cool feature that allows you to convert the standard material into a written shader. So I got to keep the fading transition. It was now code, and then I could add to that code the different layers, the different blending, and get my water material working just as intended. And I never thought I'd be using that conversion. I either started with visuals or started with coded shaders, and I'd usually stick to one or the other, but this came in handy. My favorite activity, prop making. I'm not actually kidding, it's pretty enjoyable. Every resource that the player has access to has to come from somewhere. It's very easy to just keep adding new inventory items and forget that they actually have to have a source. At least for the most part. Sure, you can have certain items that are only found in chests or in locations in cabinets and tables and whatnot, but at the same time, it's rocks. It's just rocks. So I put together a couple of boulders, giant rockies, covered them in some experimental hashing pattern, and well, I mean, it turned out pretty well, I think. But it seems there's a lot of experimentation when it comes to texturing, and it might sometimes end up with different resources looking slightly different between one another aesthetically. Maybe from a third point perspective, from someone looking at this project from the outside may not notice it, but I can kind of tell. It's like, this tree was one of the earlier designs, and it has this particular shading that isn't present on this rock or this asset or this bush. So having some consistency would probably be good. And this is where game developers and even animators and animation studios create what is called a design document for a particular asset or a particular style, particular aesthetic. They say hashing has to be like this, shading always has this tiny detail in it, never do this kind of shading, there should never be this kind of a line. So that's usually something you include in the design document for the aesthetic. But this is a solo game, so I'm kind of working these things out as I go along. Oddly enough, the weirdest challenge here was that since I have different rocks of different scales, they all had to shrink down, but the code somehow made all the rocks grow to the same size. And that didn't really make a lot of sense, and dumb reasons. Don't worry about it. In a nutshell, big rock, small rock, big scale, small scale, doesn't match, doesn't grow, doesn't shrink. Fix it. A staple of any mystery game, the good old note. That's right, players gonna be able to find notes all over the game. This involved creating the actual note that the player finds in the level, and I wanted to make sure that it offers something that captivates the player's attention, which if you've ever watched the GEC talk on The Last of Us 1 level development, you will know that one of the points the speaker had communicated about capturing the player's attention is motion. You can use motion, some sort of motion in a static scene to capture the player's movement, because we are, we are primal beings, and our eyes and minds have evolved to recognize motion first and foremost, because it, determined if you're going to be eaten or be eating tonight. So that's something that I leaned on. I rigged a tiny little 3-bone armature into this note and then made it wiggle and rustle in the rain just a little bit. A sound cue might actually be a good idea to add as well, so that the players don't miss it. Sound actually plays a huge role when you want to capture the player's attention, because if you condition them that a certain type of sound results in a certain outcome, they start salivating or something along those lines. I don't know. They'll just go out looking for it. Now, of course, because there's a note involved, you have to somehow recall it at a later time, and it has to pop up in front of the screen so the player can read it. So that's when I put together a little addition to the journal called Notes, where the player would be able to sift through all the notes they found, and it actually reuses the same paper slide effect that you see when you pick up the note for the first time. You pick up the note, paper slides in, you can read it, you can put it away, you can go into your journal, go into Notes, click on a note, and it will appear. Now, this particular feature is exclusively dedicated towards the first time you pick up the note. It just made more sense that way. I know in Fallout 4, when you pick up a note, a piece of paper flies into your face, which I think was made by some sort of an intern, because the animation looks atrocious. But then every time you want to read that note again, you go into your Pip-Boy, you go to the notes section, pick the note, and the same exact thing happens again. So you end up actually seeing the note as it is, which it makes sense. Why would a note that was on paper suddenly become a digitized message on your Pip-Boy? But I decided to go a more simpler route and simply add a separate note segment in the journal of the player, where when they click on the note, it just appears as a page within the journal rather than just a standalone rip-out piece of paper. I lied. This is the part that where I did it. This is the part where I took all the freaking doors and combined them into one same. I think I started thinking about it when I was putting together the underground silo lid opening thing, and then I realized it's gonna take a lot of time, and I put it away. And I guess this is when I was thinking, if I put it away any further, I'm gonna regret it deeply as I keep adding more doors to the game. So this is it. This is where I did it. I mean, listen, in the long run, it makes sense. Sometimes you will start a project, you will implement some sort of a feature, and then you will realize that if you keep going with the way you've implemented it, it's just gonna cause you more headaches. Long story short, good. Okay, good. We're starting to get into the actual survival meat and potatoes, literally. We got the hunger meter. The hunger meter is kind of a touchy subject. I find it looks like ass. I borrowed the idea from Minecraft that uses little chicken legs to display how much hunger you have. I think with Minecraft, one chicken leg has 2 states. It has the full state, half state, 3 states, and the empty state. I like that idea, but the way it designed the chicken leg, it looks so out of place with the rest of the environment, with the rest of the user interface and the game, and it takes a little bit too much space. Maybe having just a single chicken leg and then just have it gradually reduce in size, add more frames of chunks being eaten, might be a better idea here. It's something I have to play around further, but this is the world of user interface. You never really know what you're gonna, what kind of solution is gonna work best until you give a whole bunch a try. Of course, for the water, I did the same exact thing. It's a bottle of water with varying stages of fullness, multiple frames per each icon, and as you get thirstier, the level of water within the bottle starts decreasing. I don't know. It kind of looks janky. It also kind of looks like it fits. Again, maybe just have one bottle and one chicken leg or something along those lines. I don't know. It's freaking user interface. I don't know what these people do. User interface designers are like a whole other breed of people. They cut off a chicken's leg, sodomize a goat, read a bunch of incantations, and then great user interface just appears on the screen. I don't know. I tried it, didn't work. Yeah. You'll see me try a couple more variations of the user interface later on, and you'll see what I landed on for the time being. Speaking of user interface, the inventory items have to be usable. The player has to actually be able to use them. Consumable items have to be consumed. Also, items have to be droppable, which you could technically achieve by clicking on the inventory item and then clicking again outside of the inventory slot, and that will just drop it on the ground, which I might actually end up implementing eventually. But there's so much more things that you can do with an inventory item. So what I decided to do is create a modular approach to handling various actions you can do to an item. You right click on an item, a context menu appears, which has your usual drop or consume. Consume, of course, only for consumable items, which is something that is stored within the information of the item. Each item is assigned a particular type, which is stored within the dictionary. It has now the name of the item, the icon, category of the item, the value of the item, and then the category actually determines what kind of menus you're going to see when you right click on this item. One particular example of this would be consumable items that are supposed to have the consume or consume all menu. Another example would be the lantern and oil. You're supposed to be able to refill your lantern with oil, so you'll right click on an oil jug, click combine, click on the lantern, done. Here's another component that makes a game start look like a game: pause menu. I put together a couple of very simple, squiggly, Victorian-esque menu buttons and borders, and it's supposed to contain a standard slew of options like save, load, continue, quit to main menu, possibly settings. And there's only one reason why a developer will ever start working on the pause menu, and it's because they're working on the saving and loading system, which is exactly what we're doing. I swear, I used to dread saving and loading because of how ambiguous that entire system is, because of how many things have to be affected by saving and loading. Crops, states of enemies, existence of enemies, quests, inventories, all the different inventories, by the way, for chests, for containers, for barrels, for players' inventory, for anything that's stored in your house. You have to do that across multiple levels. Thankfully, that process is actually fairly easy to automate. You quite literally just declare a dictionary that loops through every single container, for example, backs up their inventory data, because I personally like to store inventory as one single variable within the object. I know there's a lot of YouTube tutorials on handling inventory where they create like a separate class or separate node. They declare a new class type under which it stores all sorts of information. I mean, you use whatever works for you, but in my particular case, I really like to keep things in one location, because then, hey, you want to back up the variable? There it is. It's right there. Just take that variable right there, and then push it in the file. You're done. You don't have to loop through any inventory slots. You don't have to gather all the information. This is my particular preferred, tried and tested inventory system that I use across many of my games. So, saving and loading pretty much does the same thing. Loop through every single container, which is fairly easy. You just place every single container into a node group called container or container group, and request all the nodes in that group in this level, start looping through them, take their inventory variable, pop it into like an array or a list or a dictionary, and then shove that dictionary into a physical file, save it, don't forget to close the file, and you're done. Loading, same exact process. Now, a particular quirk that I wanted to add to my saving and loading system are thumbnails, which requires me to take a screenshot of the game before you open up the pause menu. Taking a screenshot actually causes the game to stutter, which is why anytime you open up an inventory, open up the pause menu, you can see the game stutters. And what's happening is that the game is actually taking a screenshot of the entire viewport of the entire screen, so that, well, when you hit save, it actually saves a screenshot of the player. The problem is, if I take a screenshot when the player presses the save button, every screenshot is gonna end up having the pause menu in it. And I have tried, and I have not managed to make it take a screenshot by hiding the main menu, by hiding the pause menu, because technically you can hide the pause menu and then run the line of code that takes a screenshot. But the problem is that both of those lines of code will take place in the same render frame. So the menu isn't going to appear until the next render frame. And by that point, your entire saving process is already done. So that's why in this particular case, I am taking a screenshot specifically when the player is pressing the escape button to open up the pause menu. Now, technically, I have a particular idea that might allow me to bypass this, and I think maybe the stutter is actually coming from me saving the screenshot to a physical file, because the way the saving system does is you press the escape button, takes the screenshot, immediately saves that screenshot into a temporary folder. So it is nice and safe there. And then when you actually hit, let's say, save, you choose the save slot and you press the button to save it, it copies that thumbnail into a new directory, gives it a proper name that matches the save slot, and that's it. Saving is done. So I don't know if this is the case, but maybe I take the screenshot, but I don't save it to the hard drive. Maybe I keep it as just data in the memory. I don't know yet if the stutter is caused by the physical process of saving the screenshot to the hard drive, or if it's caused by the process of taking the screenshot of the whole screen. Logically, the game is already rendered to the screen. I mean, what is there to copy? Just literally take the same data that is clearly already there. I mean, geez, we see it. And then just make a copy of it and keep it in the memory. So I'll have to experiment with that when I get a chance. Now then, since we're making progress on doing saving and loading system, I noticed that my day and night cycle wasn't actually getting treated very well by the saving and loading. So I had to quite literally rewrite my day and night cycle to keep in mind what is the current time and how much time is left before the next stage of the day and night cycle begins. And this actually prompted me to create a little developer tool. It's just a side panel that allows me to set the time of day or press one of the buttons and change the fog condition, change the day and night state, maybe adjust the amount of time left before the state so I don't have to sit there and wait for 2 minutes before it's dusk, or vice versa. If I set the dusk to only last for 3 seconds, I don't have to then hunt down some place in the code to reset it back to a full cycle, because I'm definitely going to forget and push the game out, and the day-night cycle is all of 5 seconds. The environmental conditions that indicate if it's day or night have pretty much been achieved by averaging a certain amount of fog level or fog amount inside of, let's say, like an array containing all the different conditions. The day and night cycle technically makes use of the fog property, not just the ambient light, but also fog to limit the distance that the player can see. But that fog is also used for, well, literally the fog, right? The smog, the fog that you see throughout the level. So in order to make it work, I have to be able to combine the, say, environmental effects. Like if you're in a swampy area, the environment has to be greenish. If you're in a regular forest, it's got more of a blue tint. If it's nighttime, it's supposed to be, it's supposed to be kind of blackish or very dark bluish. There's also weather conditions like normal weather, rainy, or stormy, which adjust the amount of fog present in the game. And then you have all these conditions that all technically take advantage of the fog, and they have to mesh together and join together. So this is where the system of averaging came into play, where if I want to have, let's say, some swampy environment, so I add 2 fog values. Then if it's nighttime, I add 5 more fog values. And if it's supposed to be storm, I add 3 more fog values. Then I take all those values and do some averaging, and that becomes the final fog amount. Same thing happens with the ambient lighting. Same thing happens with the background color. This is pretty much the only way I have found that allowed me to combine multiple conditions, multiple times of day, and multiple weather states to one single system that more or less cooperated with each other. Yay, more user interface. It's not much of a game if the player can't take damage, so I put together a very shitty health bar. And since the health bar was circular, it actually kind of made sense to maybe use just a single chicken leg and a single water bottle icon and just position them within the health bar, because now it still communicates all the necessary information, but it doesn't take up an obscene amount of screen space. Don't fret though, I still thought this looks like ass, and I ended up playing around with some other stuff later on. At this point, I got tired of the base mechanics and I needed a change of scenery, so I started working on this house model that's supposed to be, well, another abandoned location that the player would come across. Now, this was around the time when the whole craze of AI textures and AI image generation had basically blown the frick up. Specifically, it was the Twitter post by Carson Cutry, who had presented his adaptation of the Stable Diffusion algorithm as a Blender plugin. And he basically showed that you can use Blender, open up this separate panel, type in a prompt, and a texture will just magically generate. And he made some very convincing prompts that depicted the generator working really, really well. Now, I'm looking at it and I'm seeing a potential outlet that can, well, pretty much absorb a certain chunk of workload. I didn't see it being a replacement for a lot of the texture making, because how can it? A lot of the textures have to take into account things like edge damage and edge detection. It has to take into account hatch rating. This tool would have to know exactly what kind of art style I'm going for, which would have to require an obscene amount of training in order to get even close. I would have to create so much artwork to match the art style that it just made more sense to just make the artwork for the game right away. But it didn't stop me from still experimenting with it. And I gotta say, it's a hit or miss. It generated some really interesting textures that got really close that could be used, let's say, if you have some sort of a very obscenely generic texture like some stone or rock or soil. It made sense for those types of materials. It actually generated something in approximation of usability. The interesting part is when it created unexpected results, which prompted some ideas. And this is something that happens a lot in music. In my case, I will spend hours just sitting around my music studio playing around with audio libraries, which are basically like Omnisphere, Atmosphere. The native instruments have huge libraries of instruments, and their synths also have giant amount of presets. You can open a preset, and what happens a lot of times is when I open up a preset and I play around with it, imagery just appears in my head. A lot of my location ideas are actually heavily influenced by the sounds I played around with when I was writing the music. It's absolutely phenomenal. So if you, let's say, play a game and find that the music really fits the location, it's because the music came first and the location just kind of manifested in my mind. So when that happens, I just get ideas for new interesting locations. And sometimes Stable Diffusion can actually generate such a wacky texture that it just makes me think, oh, this would actually, this location actually came to mind when I saw this texture, and now suddenly like an entire level segment was born just because of this one source of inspiration. It doesn't happen as often as it does with music though, but sometimes it may generate something pretty wacky, which though a couple of locations where I found the texture to actually be moderately usable was sand, I think some sort of brick. The weird wallpaper within this house actually came out quite interesting, and more or less that was, I think, about it. The best example I would have to say is the lake bed floor, because I put in a prompt for some black and white monochrome, almost comic book style floor of an ocean, and it had actually generated pretty much what I would have drawn, which is this wacky, almost fever dreamish like floor covered in kelp. And I thought that that was a perfectly fine fit, and I think I might not have even come up with the weird twists and turns and just the multiple layers that it had ended up generating. So that was one case where Stable Diffusion had actually generated something very quite usable. The problem is that it took me like an hour to get to that point, and I wouldn't consider that to be a creative process as much as a discovery process. So it's one of those, AI generated stuff debates, whether or not it's you creating or it creating, I don't care, because it generated something that I could use, but the problem is that AI cannot enter your mind. No matter how well you write the prompts, it cannot capture the exact image you have in your head. So if you're trying to create something vital, you're gonna waste so much time and not even getting what you want. But if you're trying to create something trivial, which in game development, texture making is one of those things that just, it takes so freaking long when the texture is a ground or a soil or stone wall. Like, how many stone walls can you really make before you lose your goddamn mind? So if you need to create something fairly repetitive, fairly generic, I actually find this to be quite a valuable tool. But a lot of special made props, like for example that underground vault entrance, or the the silo entrance with a flipping door. There's no way in hell Stable Diffusion would ever be able to generate a texture for that, because that texture is catered specifically to every single corner, twist, and turn of that model. And there's a lot of models like that. So if, however, we're dealing with something that's a repeating pattern and that spans across a giant distance, Stable Diffusion works. So I see it as no more than a tool. It's no more useful or no less useful than, like a brush in Krita. So you just have to keep in mind the downfalls of it, because it is possible to waste just hours and hours and hours and not really getting anything interesting. But on the bright side, whatever you might get could spawn in new ideas if you're tuned to that kind of a frame of mind or working process or workflow method. One particular extra use I did note, and this is for the Atomicon project, I can generate approximations of posters, like advertisement posters for, cigarettes and vacuum cleaners and sundaes and diners and all sorts of stuff. It will generate some pretty mangled people, but it remarkably matches the general art style and color palette. More importantly, color palette. So at that point, I could take that poster and rearrange certain elements, put in new elements, and hand touch up a lot of the things, like the fucked up hands and the discontorted faces. Get that all in order, paint in all the human stuff, and it is something that can speed up that particular process. Like, again, it's not supposed to replace you. You're supposed to work with it to achieve what you want. And when you're a solo developer and you're working on the ginormous game and you have a metric fuck ton of work to do, tools like this could be quite a weight over your shoulders. Oh yeah, and there's also a little ball prop that the player should be able to play around with that we ended up putting in, and of course in this case hand texturing it. There's supposed to be quite a creepy interaction with that ball. It's supposed to be in the little playground of this abandoned house. When the player walks up to it and they will likely kick it, they will see that the ball gets kicked back to them. And there's a particular quest involved with that. So, creepy stuff. Oh, yeah, of course, I've spent the last 10 minutes talking about a point for a slide that only now is rolling up. This was the section when I was working on the floor bed, and where Stable Diffusion came in quite handy in generating that wacky kelp floor bed texture, which I was surprised how well it actually fit. The standing kelp, or the ocean lettuce, or whatever you call it, it actually fit aesthetically pretty well. Now, this was around the point when I started experimenting with all the water stuff. So the first step would, of course, make water or underwater actually look like underwater. And the first thing I started doing was messing around with the camera blur depth of field. The world environment node adds a whole bunch of really cool effects to the camera view, or technically in this case to the post-process stage. So what I had done here is use the world environment node to add depth of field whenever the camera reaches below the level of water. This is a particular effect that I borrowed from Soma, the distance objects being blurred out and kind of slowly fading into view, all creepy like. I thought that was just an absolutely fantastic effect. So I'm like, grab that, put it in here. That's a fantastic effect. I want to have it. I want it. And of course, since I am already working on all the underwater stuff, I might as well get ourselves some screen distortions for that very moment when the camera either dives underwater or breaches the surface of water. This was done by, well, adding a bit of an overlay effect. Again, I just started with a big old sprite or some sort of a flat texture. I used a visual shader in order to apply screen distortion, and it's the same exact process that I used for making that screen distortion effect in the Dreadtail project, whenever the enemies appeared on the screen and they caused that segment of the screen to distort. In this particular case, I just used a noise texture or a clouds texture, which is a type of noise you can generate for yourself, and just offset a bunch of pixels in X and Y coordinates to get kind of like a watery effect. Having multiple of those textures and having them scroll at different speeds while applying some sort of blending mode actually goes a long way in making the effect feel more randomized. For the dive into the water, I also wanted to put in a bunch of bubbles, which in their own turn also distorted the screen a little bit. And again, this is just the point where I have to commend the Godot developer team on their fine work of adding the visual shader system. Because yes, you could do this in code, but god damn is it super fast in the visual shader. This is what I think Unreal Engine developers think about blueprints with their base coding, those poor bastards. Granted, Unreal Engine also has a node-based system for their shader editor, which was also a fantastic tool, but this is just beautiful. It is unbelievable how many effects you can come up with the visual shader alone, as long as you know what to plug it into what and you have a little bit of creativity about you. Ah, that's the kelp. That's the kelp I was talking about. Again, simple sprite, but I did end up distorting it using a shader. Now, the shader technically was supposed to behave in a very particular way. It's your standard wave shader, so we're just using a sine wave to offset the X position of a texture, but it's not supposed to affect the entire sprite all at once. You see, the bottom of the kelp is supposed to be rooted firmly into the ground. So if I had kept the shader with just a simple wave, you would see the roots quite literally just wiggling left and right, which would not make a lot of sense. So this is where just a tiny extra effort can yield you just the right result. And all I did here is created a separate image, which effectively simply contained a gradient going from black to white. And the way color works in shaders is that any color technically is a value between 0 and 1. If it's a grayscale texture, then black is 0, white is 1. So I had made a texture that had the same dimensions as the kelp itself, and I made the bottom black and the top white, and I used the color data to multiply the strength of the offset within the visual shader. So that means that anywhere the gradient is black, there is no effect. Anywhere the gradient is white, you have full effect. And because it is a smooth gradient, any value between black and white in turn adjusts the amount of the effect in that particular coordinate of the pixel. And again, this is something that the visual shader editor had just been absolutely phenomenal. I almost think that for something stupidly simple as this, a code shader would have been an overkill. Hey, look, it's my favorite thing. User interface. Yeah, well, back at it again, trying to figure out some user interface that doesn't look like ass. I'm still adamant with sticking to a circular design, but there are 3 parameters that need to be displayed. We have health, we have stamina, and we have air. Listen, if there's some courses out there available for specifically user interface design, please link them in the comments below, because this should not be taking up this much time. I'm looking for any sort of creative way of displaying this stuff instead of just bars. But hey, at least we're making progress, because once you start adding health bars and stamina and air, that means you're probably going to be programming those things into the game, and that's usually when the game starts actually feeling like a game. Speaking of user interface, there are a lot of items that are stackable in the game. However, there's also a lot of items that have an amount, but it's not necessarily a unit amount where it represents a stack. For example, the amount of oil in the lantern and in the oil jugs. Even though technically the amount of oil is represented in the same exact property as, say, the amount of bottles or the amount of sticks or the amount of berries you've picked up, it didn't really feel as interesting to represent that as just a number in the corner of the item icon. So I decided to represent the oil level as a little teardrop just in the same corner. Godot's texture progress node allows you to pretty much make anything into a progress bar. That's exactly what I did for this little indicator. And then in the span of the same session, I decided to work on some consumable resources. I don't know, sometimes you just have enough and you gotta switch gears. So I had adjusted the code of our berry bush, which was one of the earliest assets I've programmed in, and I tried to turn it into something more generic and reusable where you can just instance a new scene from it and create a new pick-upable resource. This particular resource is a little bit different from, say, when you chop down a tree and pick up wood. This is a replenishable resource, which means there's supposed to be some sort of a stem or object that remains in one place, and then there's a timer that counts down to a certain amount of seconds before that resource respawns. In this particular case, it was a mushroom. Cooking delicious meals is going to be a big subject of the game, so foraging is going to be playing a pretty significant role. So at this juncture, it made sense to program some sort of a replenishable resource that you can swap out a sprite and tell it what kind of an item it drops, and that's it. And I think we're doing more sprite work. I swear, in this session, we're just crop dusting features all over the place. Reeds! Yes, you need reeds next to bodies of water. That's important. Zillion had another plugin that came in quite handy. I think it's called the Asset Placer or Asset Scatterer, where you quite literally just drop in a scene and then you can place the scenes and instance the scenes all throughout the level. Although I did notice that there is a bug with the plugin where it does not account for offset of the original Asset Placer node. It's something that actually gave me a lot of headaches, and I actually came this close to trying to go dive into the plugin to try to figure out what the heck is happening until I realized, hey, maybe we should keep that node in the 0,0 coordinate of the world and everything will be in its correct place. Who would have thought? What did not, however, work is the plugin scattering code. I don't know what was the problem, but for some reason, it was placing the same asset in the same mouse position way too often, and it somehow failed to realize that the mouse hasn't moved. There's technically supposed to be code in it. I'm pretty sure there is code in there, and I've raised this issue with the developer once before, and I think maybe they have fixed it, but the issue had cropped back up. So essentially, you would press a mouse button, and then as you're moving it about, it's dependent on, I think, like frame rate maybe to place the assets, and I would end up with having 2 or 3 or 5 reads being placed in one same location on the mouse, which, besides the obvious of being a waste, just adds a whole bunch of work where I have to now locate every duplicate and delete it. So this time I actually went into the plugin and I've added a little bit of an addition where it counts down a certain amount of milliseconds before placing another asset, and the rate at which it places the assets can be adjusted. Now, it's not as perfect because if you press and hold the mouse button and then hold it in one place, it will still place the asset in that same location if the timer runs out and you haven't moved the mouse. However, at least now it's not going to consistently place assets in the same spot. If you move your mouse around enough and you don't overlap with existing placements, you should be fine. Hey, it's that thing I said I did like 4 clips ago. You know, maybe I should just do these updates a lot more frequently than, say, once every quarter, because you tend to forget. You're saying, oh yes, that's the part where we did this thing that we will actually be doing 4 clips later. This is the actual Kelp Wiggle shader, and I guess I was full of shit because I did write it in code. I swear to God, man, I need to like start adding notes or something, or do these updates a lot more often. Hey, look at that. We're working on fog. This is just a little bit of billboarding fog that I wanted to place above the surface of the water. Didn't end up looking as great as I thought it would. Primarily because the texture is supposed to be somewhat transparent, which means I have to rely on either opacity, which Godot has issues with, or additive blending, which Godot has issues with. It didn't really sit very well with the environment fog. Essentially, the fog would actually be displayed almost on top of the environmental fog, the fog you can enable in World Environment node, the one that gives that a nice Silent Hilly vibe. So because of these depth draw issues, which is something that I come across a few times when you deal with alpha objects, I ended up scrapping the idea. Who knows, maybe I'll revisit it, play around with the settings, maybe, I don't know, instead of alpha transparent fog, I'll actually have some sort of a sprite, a cartoony fog, right? Something along those lines. Although, having real fog might be a lot more interesting. Since we're within the general proximity of water, I decided to program in the drowning mechanic. Fun. But I gotta say, curiously enough, once you start adding things that can actually damage and kill you, and once you actually add the mechanic of death, that's when, curiously enough, the game starts feeling like an actual game. It has stakes. Stakes. This is also where I decided to redraw the user interface, specifically the air meter, to essentially be a number of air bubbles. It still acts as a progress bar though, but, you know, at least it communicates that it's air now, instead of communicating how much sausage you have left. The vast plains of soil were feeling a little bit barren at this point, so I had covered them with grass using a multi-mesh node. If I'm correct, the multi-mesh instance node is quite literally here for this very purpose. The multi-mesh instance node is really cool because it can allow you to supply a particular mesh and then tell the multi-mesh instance, cover this entire mesh in a particular other mesh. In my case, this was a rectangle which displayed a picture of the grass. Now, I have, I believe, 3 different designs of grass, and I honestly wish they'd put a little bit more work into the multi-mesh instance code, or the multi-mesh instance node specifically, like, for example, being able to supply multiple meshes to populate it with, because right now, in order for me to populate 3 grasses, I have to use 3 multi-mesh instances with varying randomness amounts. You also can't edit the multi-mesh instance unless you are using the multi-mesh function, so that means you have to either code it using runtime or you have to develop your own plugin. Why isn't this a part of the actual functionality? I mean, you have a node explicitly programmed to display thousands of a particular mesh. Clearly, its prime purpose is for things like grasslands, things like bushes, right? Something that you need to populate the entire world in. And yet, after you populate those assets, there's no in-editor way to, say, get rid of some or move them around. I mean, yes, you can make a plugin for it, but how many Godot users know how to make a plugin? I know I could. I made a freaking plugin to help me with some of the stuff. I added another one, but at the same time, it's there. Just put it like a couple of hours of extra work into it. And most Godot Engine users can't make plugins, they just make games. You know, if you're doing the job, do it right. Get a just tiny little bit more effort. Whatever, I know I'm gonna get shit for it. I don't give a fuck, it doesn't matter. I've been down this road before. Stop dying. Of course, the neat thing about this grass placement is the fact that when you apply a shader to a single sample, so to speak, the sample rectangle that you used to populate all over the world, all of the instances will use the same shader, which means the whole always look at the camera billboarding effect was automatically applied to everything else. Now, come to think of it, and this is just an idea I've had literally right now, I am using 3 different meshes for grass, which means they all use 3 different shaders. Technically, it's only 3 shaders, but if I were to add more grass, I would have had to create more shaders, more multi-mesh instances, more grass all over the place. So maybe I could create a single shader using visual shaders, which would, well, effectively choose one of, say, 5 or 7 or 10 different textures of grass based on the X, Y, Z location of the grass mesh being used as a seed. So we sampled the world location of the object, which I believe we should be able to do within the input node of the visual shader, feed that into the randomness calculator, spew out a number between 1 and 10, and then that will be the image we'll be using. This way I still get a whole bunch of variety, and it all uses just one single shader. And man, adding grass alone has added so much context to the world. It's just grass. And yet, it feels a lot less barren. But hey, we haven't strayed too far away from water. If we now can take damage from running out of air, we should probably have some sort of a bubble sprite that elevates slowly to the surface from the player's mouth. So after a few minutes of finagling with Creator's animation toolset, we got ourselves a nice bubble animation, export the render frames back into Godot Engine, pop open a nice little particle system, pop in the animation frames, toil, which is an oil, and we got ourselves a nice breath indicator. Speaking of oil, this was right around the time I programmed the actual refilling mechanic for our lantern. Again, we're trying to think of crafting or technically combining items in such a way that allows us to repurpose the system in other cases. So the way I went about it is I went to the item database, which is a variable in the master node, which is my singleton, which contains quite literally the list, the dictionary of all the items that are available in the game. And every single item has the name, the icon, description, stats, and whatnot. One of the properties that I've added is called combined with. It's essentially an extra key value pair which contains an array of all the item names with which this item could be combined. Stop dying. So in the case of the oil jug, the combined with contained an array with just a single item called lantern. Realistically, the way the combining works right now is the amount value from the oil simply gets deposited into the lantern. And for the most part, I think that's how combining is pretty much going to work. Combining isn't really creating new items, it's more taking some essence from one item and depositing it into another, like the case with oil and lantern. If you are looking to create something new, however, you'll have to use a crafting station. Now, switching gears a little bit, we have a number of items in the game that provide a source of light. Right now, technically, the only one present in the game as of this particular clip is a torch. And the weird thing about a torch is that it is emanating light as soon as you place it into the world, which seemed kind of weird, and also maybe giving the player the ability to extinguish torches might be good. Maybe having some sort of an enemy that is susceptible to light, or maybe they're attracted by the light, so you have to make sure that you don't have a light source present, or maybe not that kind of light source. So I decided to add a set of matches, which in the game they're referred to as lighting sticks. It is a base inventory item, but the way it works is a little bit different from, say, another item that you would have to equip to actually use. The way the lighting sticks work is they just sit in your inventory, and whenever you need to light up a, let's say, a campfire, a stove, or a torch, you simply just have to click on that item to light it up, and a single match will be used up from your inventory. You don't actually have to equip it, because I actually found that to be kind of an annoyance. It's like, why? Yes, it makes sense. You have to equip the matches in order to use a match, but it's something that you would use so often in the game that I felt it just made right to say, okay, players just going to take out a match, use it, and that is going to be implied. We don't actually have to, let's say, select it in the hotbar. I do have to include a notification maybe on the side of the screen somewhere to say that a single match has been used. And this particular approach simply comes from my memories of playing Amnesia: The Dark Descent, where you could find these matches all over the level, and there's a whole bunch of candles and a whole bunch of lanterns and lightable objects, and the game just uses one of the matches from your collected inventory to light them up. And since we're on the subject of torches, I realized that there's no way to create torches. There's quite literally no way to make them. So this is where I went down the rabbit hole of simple craftable items, the kind of items that you don't need a crafting bench for. Very simple recipes, like the Minecraft 4-block crafting section in your own inventory. Now, of course, to make torches, we needed to have the resource out of which to make torches, which would be sticks. And nothing in the game actually drops sticks. So I went down the rabbit hole of expanding the drop table for our trees. Right now, I think they only dropped special embers and nothing else. And I figured, you know what? Might as well. Let's make them also drop wooden logs and make them drop sticks. Now, I did mention this before, but the way the trees work in the game is that when you chop them down, they don't actually disappear from the world. Mainly because I've noticed this with a lot of games, especially The Forest, where when you chop down a tree, and let's say you need a lot of trees to build a wood cabin, the problem that you end up with is that all the trees are gone. You've now built your wood cabin in the middle of this tree clearing. So you would spend all this time looking for a nice looking, pleasant view, and then you proceed to destroy that view by chopping down every tree in the vicinity, because we're not going to travel like a kilometer away to chop the trees on the other side just so we can preserve it. There's cannibals out there. They're gonna eat my ass. Seriously, that is a legitimate problem that I wanted to avoid. I wanted to avoid having barren land. So the way I went about it is that when you chop down a tree, instead of displaying a stump or just deleting the tree entirely, I made the tree sprite display a giant gushing granny. A giant gaping slit across the middle of the trunk. This is visually very apparent, and it will act as a cue that this tree has already been harvested. Of course, there will be a timer that allows the tree to regrow and replenish its resources over some amount of time. So with that in place, the trees could now drop not only special ambers, but also wooden logs and sticks. And since we have those items in place, it was time to program the actual campfire. We got a bunch of stones, we created a new scene and arranged all the sprites in 3D space, nice and neat. Place a few logs, place a few particle systems, and then, damn, we got ourselves a nice looking campfire. I'm really running dry on creative commentary at this point. It's a bunch of sprites, people. Give me a break. With the campfire object in place, it was time to create the actual crafting inventory. I chose to add a separate page in your journal, which will contain a list of very basic items that you can craft at that point in time. At this point, I don't think I'm going to be using a particular formation for the items. I'm probably going to go more along the lines of Factorio style crafting, where you just need to have the items in your inventory and you click on the recipe and it just checks if you have enough of the required resources, and if you do, it spawns an item and pops it into your inventory or even just drops it in front of you. Yes, the Minecraft style crafting system where you arrange items in a particular formation is a very creative one, but I don't know if it's really going to be that beneficial in this particular game. So something a lot simpler would probably go a long way. And again, these things are not really set in stone. I might end up switching the crafting interface style to be something a little bit less cumbersome, something more compact. It'll get the job done for the time being. Of course, the way the crafting system is done is in a very modular approach, like all the other systems I've put together. I have a single dictionary which contains a list of items that the player can craft, and each item contains a key value pair which corresponds to a list of ingredients that need to be met. Anytime the player, say, opens up the inventory, it performs a check to see if you have all the required items and crafts the item for you. Of course, in order to craft the torch, I had to add an extra inventory item, which is a piece of cloth rag. And with that in place, we finally have our system that allows us to craft basic items that do not require an entire crafting bench to make. And it wasn't until I started placing those torches when I realized that there's an awkward bug that I've been ignoring and overlooking this entire time. And it's the fact that when you place the torches into the world, the torch that you place doesn't match the torch that you were holding. You see, torches are randomly choosing their visual aesthetic, their visual design. Could be a stick with a can on top of it, could be just a short, tiny little stub of wood. But generally speaking, when you're choosing where to place the torch, you are able to see the actual torch stuck to your mouse in 3D space. The problem is that when you click to actually place the torch, it again randomly chooses a different type of visual sprite. So what I decided to do is scrap that whole system, rewrite it a bit to make sure that when you are placing a torch, it actually places the torch that was stuck to your mouse. So the system effectively says, hey, do you have something in your inventory that is placeable? You do? Okay, let's instance that placeable thing and then make it follow the mouse. So when you click the left mouse button to place that item, instead of instancing yet another one, which would end up making it regenerate the sprite, it basically says, cool, just let go of this item that's following the mouse, instance a new one, and Bob's your uncle. Yes, I could have technically programmed the system where it's a, let's say, a separate function within the torch script that says, set torch design or set torch type, set torch sprite, and then when you click to place a torch, it instances a new torch, but then runs that function which tells it, hey, you're supposed to be this particular torch design, which is the same as the one that's following the mouse, but whatever, man. It works. Oh yeah, man, we're gonna get some water here. Water. You gotta have water in the game, so I put together a quick sprite containing a bottle of water. Now, in this game, there's gonna be sources of fresh water and there's sources of dirty water. Dirty water is kind of a last resort thing, but you can purify it, and then clean water usually comes from things like wells, water pumps, and I think even in-home plumbing if it's intact. You can take dirty water and purify it in pots or above stoves or campfires. And since I was on the subject, I decided to put together a quick sprite of a water pump that you'd be able to find out in random locations in the game. Again, the texturing of the water pump was done within Blender's own texture editing tools, which I'm slowly warming up to, although I have lost progress a whole bunch of times when I forgot to save the texture. The animation of the water pump was again done in Godot's engine own animation player node, and essentially the way the water pump works is it can either allow you to replenish your own thirst, or if you have equipped an empty bottle of water in your hotbar and you're actively holding it, it will instead refill the bottle of water with clean water. It will subtract one empty water bottle from the inventory slot and then deposit one full clean water bottle into your inventory backpack. And of course, since we have the water pump to provide clean water, I also decided to, since I'm on the subject of it, provide a source of dirty water. Dirty water will usually come from puddles and ponds, and I haven't done it in this session yet, but puddles would be finite. You cannot just keep coming back to them and treating them as an infinite source of water. Fishing! What's an RPG game without fishing? I personally enjoy fishing, maybe even a little bit more than my dad does, because last time we went fishing near Lake Simcoe, we actually spent, oh man, we got there early morning, it was nice and foggy, and we caught nothing. We caught nothing, but I still had a blast because it's one of those things when you're casting a reel and you're like, maybe now. Maybe I'll get something now. It's so addicting. It's the addiction of Vegas without the family ruin and financial destruction. I don't know. I enjoy it. So that's why I wanted to have fishing in this game as well. We started with a bit of modeling to get the fishing rod design in place, and in order to get the bending effect, I actually ended up relying on Godot's engine inverse kinematics features, which is a special type of node that you can place into a skeleton 3D, and you can make a special secondary node that acts as a target. And basically what it does is it says, this armature, this set of bones have to try to reach that particular node. So by moving that node, you essentially move the entire armature structure, the entire hierarchy. So you can have a point in space and then use it to move the arm up and down. And that's exactly how I got the bending effect, the bending animation on that fishing rod without necessarily relying on, well, animating it in Blender. The benefit of this is that you can program the fishing rod to bend a little bit when, let's say, there's a catch on the other side. And the catch on the other end is pulling on the fishing line, which in turn makes your fishing rod bend a bit as well. Which means the larger the catch, the more it bends, which is something that's going to be a lot easier to adjust with this inverse kinematics node, rather than having like 15 different rod bending animations baked into the object. I ended up putting maybe a little bit too much time into the fishing mechanic because I wanted to make it so that the player can control how far they can cast the reel. I wanted to make sure that they have the ability to point where they cast the reel, which was a bit of a conundrum to figure out because the player doesn't really aim with the camera. The place where the camera is looking isn't necessarily where the player is aiming because it is technically a third-person game. So what I decided to do is use the coordinate of the mouse in 3D space to figure out where exactly is the line is cast. I detected the left click, I projected array from screen space into 3D space using the very functions for just that purpose that Godot's engine's camera offers to us. With that calculated, what I get in return is a 3-dimensional coordinate, and that is where the line is actually cast, where the bobber and the lure are thrown to. We made a little strength indicator which tells us how far we cast the line. And speaking of line, some particular challenge I've had was with attempting to make the actual fishing line have a bit of a curve from the tip of the fishing rod leading up to the bobber. I'm not sure why, but displaying a bunch of line segments or meshes at a particular interval and updating their position, scale, and rotation to pseudo create the fishing line was surprisingly taxing on the system, and I'm not entirely sure why. So after playing around with it for a little bit, I decided for now, let's just stick with a straight line going from the tip of the rod to the bobber. And now, with that in place, we can finally start catching all sorts of crap. First of all, we had to put together the loot table of the lake, so to speak. This would be the first time I've ever had to deal with anything regarding loot tables, and to figure this out, I could have spent a whole bunch of time trying to finagle my own system, but I decided just to go to the game dev subreddit and ask some professionals who have already been down this road, who have created these sort of systems by this point. The goal was to have a particular set of lures, and different types of lures have different likelihoods of catching certain types of fish. So you could have worm in this case, and you could have, say, corn, worm and corn. Technically, both worm and corn could both catch this one type of fish, but corn is more likely to catch this type, and worm is more likely to catch the other type. So the challenge was to figure out how to create the algorithm that is going to determine what it is that you catch. And the solution that was suggested, I honestly found to be ingenious. So what you do is you start by taking your 100% of likelihood of catching something, and then you break that 100% into segments, chunks of various things that could be caught. So for example, right now there's fish, there's a fish carcass, so you can literally just catch a carcass of a fish, which has resources that you would want to use. You can also catch nothing, and you could also lose bait. So there's 4 different outcomes at this current point in time. So what you do, according to the advice I received from Reddit's users, you take the 100%, you distribute the various percentages into those 4 categories. So for example, with corn, it would be, let's say 50% catching the fish, 30% catching the carcass, and then the remainder is broken apart into catch nothing or lose bait entirely. And you can repeat this process for as many different catches as you want. And the general approach to this is you take the table of everything that is capable of being caught, and then you start looping through those items, and then you generate a random number, and you start subtracting those percentages from that random number. The moment the subtraction reaches 0, whichever item caused the number to reach 0 or below, that's the catch. So, logically speaking, if shuffling results in, let's say, I don't know, you generated number of 30, that's the random number. And then when you shuffled it, the first item in the shuffled array happens to be the fish, right? The fish is supposed to catch, and it is a 50% catch rate. Okay, well, your random number is 30, the catch is 50. When the 50 is subtracted from 30, you get a negative number, that's your catch. So I thought this was an ingeniously simple system. I don't have the mathematical know-how to know if there's any flaws behind it, so I decided to go with this one. Considering that this is the very first loot table I've ever put together in my entire life, and there's gonna be a lot more once we get to the Atomicon project, it seemed like it would work just fine. So that's fishing. It is now in the game. I don't know why, but I thought it would be a lot more complicated than it actually was. That's something that actually happens a lot. I will look into technically a system I've never programmed before, and I would just kind of avoid it and meander around it and be like, yeah, we can leave it until later. And then once it actually comes time to implement it, I'm like, the hell? This is nothing. Took me like, what, a couple of hours to implement it? And once it's done, I'm like, really? You could have been done all this time? Anyways, wild resources, another big part of the game. You have to do a bunch of scavenging, a bunch of resource finding. Where do those resources come from? Well, they have to spawn somewhere in the forest. Speaking of somewhere in the forest had a really cool approach to creating spawnable resources. It sounds kind of dumb, but if you stand on one spot, look north, you will find a rock on the ground. If you then pick up that rock, look away, and then look north again, there will be another rock somewhere in the vicinity of where you already picked up the rock. So they did not hide the concept that the rocks just magically spawn out of nowhere, which of course makes base building a lot easier, but it also doesn't help that it requires 200 freaking rocks to build a teeny tiny measly wall that cannibals just like over it, and they don't care. So who knows, maybe they had a problem that these constructible structures are taking up too many resources. What should we do? Shall we reduce the resource count? No, let's just make magical rocks appear when they look away. Make them grind the living shit out of their weekend building that wall that will get demolished by the first brute that sees it in a matter of seconds. Really, Ant Knight? Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. I will admit that the resource spawning mechanic in the forest is a pretty suitable way of replenishing resources in the world, where the player's constantly scavenging, constantly chopping down trees, and constantly collecting stuff. So I've decided to take the same modular approach that I use for any one of my other systems, and I've created a single object. My approach to this was to repurpose a collision shape node that already comes with Godot Engine, and the idea was to use a cylindrical collision shape, and the cylinder, the radius of the cylinder, will act as a visual cue when I'm building out the level, determining the radius within which a resource will spawn. And the resource itself is defined within an export variable of the object. And it's not just a single resource. I made sure to give myself some variety and some functionality just in case in the future I want to make a particular zone that spawns, say, mushrooms and berries, or mushrooms and pebbles or sticks. So it is effectively an array where you can define two things. You can define the name of the resource to spawn and the number of that resource that needs to be spawned. And the way the system will work is, once in a while, when the timer runs out, it will say, do we still have all of the same resources that correlate to this list? If we don't, pick a random spot within the confines of the radius of the cylinder and place it in that random location. There's an extra routine there that uses a raycast to make sure that it doesn't hit like a tree or a boulder. It always has to hit terrain. If it hits terrain, we can place the resource there. And then it does a little check mark that says, yep, we now have that one resource accounted for. And if there's 10, it continues the process until it has all 10. The actual resource itself, when it spawns in, it grows from a 0 scale to a normal scale of 1, and that's basically it. When the player picks up a bunch of resources, they actually get marked off. When the timer runs out, the collision shape performs a little statistics check, a little roll call. Do you still exist? Do you still exist? Do you still exist? Any ones that don't exist, any resources that have been picked up by the player get removed from the array, and now it goes in with a cycle of creating more resources. With that in place, I now have the ability to place any kind of resources in any space on the map without programming literally anything extra, or, God forbid, placing them by hand. All I have to do is just drag one of those scenes into the level, adjust the radius of the collision shape, and we're good. It will just now spawn the resource on the timer in that particular location. So, with that in place, we finally reached the last component I have programmed in this particular development cycle for Child of Aether, the combat system. This would be the second or third time that I'm looking at the system, because the very first attempt at making the combat system was kind of a wishy-washy approach. It attempted to innovate without any sort of innovation, and the only reason why I'm saying innovation is because I just felt like trying something different than what I have already gotten used to in a lot of the games. I wouldn't call it innovation for the sake of innovation, but it's more innovation because I'm just kind of tired of the same combat systems everywhere else. Now, yes, there are tried and tested combat systems that are already present in all of these successful games. Those are exactly the same systems that I got tired of. I still had no idea what the hell I was going to put in. It's still clicking as far as I was concerned. The combat system that was implemented in the game at this juncture was you move the mouse off the side of the enemy, left click and hold the mouse, and slide the mouse, cursor goes across the enemy takes damage. Hell on your wrist, welcome carpal tunnel. Ugh. It was a little bit different, and my argument for it was that this particular combat system makes the player participate in the combat a little bit more than click, wait for the player to damage. Click, wait for the player to damage. And then in the meantime, you're getting your ass handed to you. I wanted to combine a little bit of action. And action means actually doing something rather than just standing there and waiting for your character to finish his moveset. And still, I didn't want to go with a click type of combat system, because that kind of combat I too thought was an equivalent of getting a participation trophy. It's like, yes, you left clicked. And it was around this time when I had one of my late night development cycles. I was watching Markiplier play a game called Inscryption, and I immediately fell in love with the visual aesthetic of the game and the game's combat system. The whole premise of you damaging not just opponent's cards but also damaging the opponent himself, which technically wasn't a new concept. Magic the Gathering was the other tabletop game that I knew that had that particular system. You, the player, are the master. You have a certain amount of hit points, and then you die when you receive that many hit points. So I did like the way the cards themselves were used to damage the enemy. However, I did not want to turn this game into a turn-based combat one. And there were a number of problems that need to be resolved. Primarily, if you go with a just left click to a tap type of thing, you end up with, well, what you end up with Minecraft, which is where you spam the left button, and that more or less determines the amount of damage you can deal. Yes, there's some sort of a timer involved, but you pretty much go around the dungeon spamming the left click. And another requirement was that I wanted to implement a particular component of strategy into your combat, which when you're just left clicking, there's not a whole lot of strategy. It's like, when you left click, you attack. Cool. That's about it. Sure, you can maybe like walk your character around, but that's not really strategy. That's just reflexes. So how do we make a combat system that has the player participate in combat actively, but also involves some strategy? And that's when I figured, why not use cards for strategy, but keep the combat in real time? And that was pretty much the conception point of the card-based real-time combat system that is currently featured in the game. Here's the basic rundown of how the combat system works. You still use left clicking in order to attack the enemy. However, your attack isn't determined by some sort of a player stat alone. It is actually determined by the card that you're currently wielding, the top card in your hand. So you have the deck of cards, you have the hand of cards. Pretty standard stuff in just about any card-based game. But the difference is that since this is still real-time combat, when you left click on an enemy, it simply uses up the card in the hand and it goes back to the deck. The damage rating and the effects of your attack are determined by whichever card comes next. And this is where I believe I found a way to implement the first little bit of strategy component into this combat. You see, you can actually take the card from the hand at any position and move it to the front of the deck or to the back of the deck, or quite literally rearrange it anywhere within the hand. Because the one major difference of this card-based combat system is that you don't use any card in the deck. You only use the frontmost card in the deck. Whichever card is currently at the forefront of the deck is the card that's going to be used to deal damage. So, where in a classical card-based game, whatever cards you have in the hand are all freely available to you in any order you'd like. You can pick up any card from the hand and use it in combat. In this game, the forefront card at the front of the deck is the one that's used to perform an attack. When the player executes the attack, that card is used up and it goes back into the deck. The next card in your hand is used for the next attack. Now, the strategy component that I mentioned before comes from the fact that you have the ability to move around cards within the hand so that the most, say, applicable cards to dealing with this particular enemy type are at the front. So what I imagine can happen is you're in some sort of a location. You see there's a particular enemy in the distance, you recognize what this enemy is. You know you have a bunch of cards that can deal effective damage against that particular enemy, but they're kind of located all over the deck, or they're in the deck, or they're kind of scattered all over the hand. So you can choose to rearrange those cards at the forefront to make sure that your next few attacks deal damage to that enemy. Here's the caveat. In order to rearrange the cards, you have to sacrifice something. You have to sacrifice your action points, which also double as your stamina. That is a mechanic that I'm borrowing from Fallout 4, and I believe maybe even Fallout 3 New Vegas. When you're sprinting, I believe it uses your action points. It definitely happens in Fallout 4. I can't quite recall off the top of my head about 3 or New Vegas. The action points is one of those stats that the player's supposed to upgrade over time to allow them to participate in longer streaks of combat, attacking multiple enemies one after another, allowing them to spend a lot more time within hostile environments. Different games use different limiting factors in order to prevent the player from going off into areas that are supposed to be late game stage areas. Most often they place enemies that are of high level, that deal a lot of damage, certain enemies that maybe have certain moves that can catch up with the player unless the player has some special ability or special mechanic or some sort of an object, some MacGuffin that they discover at some point in the story that allows them to bypass these particular enemies. Besides that, there's blocked passageways and locked doors and all sorts of stuff. So the approach I'm going to see about taking when defining the progression curve of all the different zones in the game is by first starting off the player with base stats which actually limit how effective combat be at the early stages. And at this juncture, this can pretty much be defined by two parameters. How good are your cards and how much action points you have. The quality of the cards will determine whether or not you'll be able to defeat that enemy before it kicks your ass. The second parameter determines how long you can stay in combat within a particular zone. Because what I haven't mentioned yet is that you can only attack with the cards in your hand. As soon as the attack is done, that card goes back into the deck. Once it's in the deck, you have to pull it out again. In order to pull it out, you have to use action points. So you can enter a zone with 5 really great cards in your hand, and you'll spend those cards defeating the first 5 enemies, and then realize that you don't have enough action points to pull out the cards out of the deck anymore. I mean, you're only as good as your ability to pull those cards out of your deck. The only way you can continue exploring that area and defeating the enemies so you can progress past them and discover more of the story is solely dependent on your ability to pull out cards out of your deck and being able to rearrange them so that you use the most effective cards against a particular type of enemy first. All of that relies on your action points. And action points is a stat that you're gonna have to upgrade throughout your journey. And then the main question is, where do you get action points when you're in the middle of combat? Food. you get action points from food. And most importantly, not just any food, good food. You can't go out and pick up berries and mushrooms and consuming them and expect that you're going to get a lot of action points in return. This is where the farming and crafting comes into play with your ability to actually discover these locations, perform effective combat, and more importantly, staying in combat for longer. If you have a certain very elaborately cooked meals, so meals that require a lot of ingredients to put together, those meals can replenish your action points immediately. As soon as you consume a dish, your action points goes back up, and then you can stay in combat for longer. If you pack your inventory full of really high AP food dishes, it will allow you to go through that location, constantly replenishing your AP, staying in combat, and it'll allow you to survive for a lot longer. Supplemented, of course, by having a lot of really good combat cards, because having a lot of action points isn't going to do you much good when every single card deals 1 damage. And you've got yourself a real-time combat system that still takes a little bit of strategy to get around. And with that combat system in place, there's a lot of cool things you can start doing, like, for example, having merchant shops that sell rare cards. You can craft cards using recipes. You can find cards in locations that you explore, and you can have enemies that are susceptible to one type of card, but are more or less immutable to another. And finally, this particular idea I got for an enemy that destroys the card that destroyed it, which I imagine would be such a pain in the ass to all the players. Effectively, it's an enemy that says, whatever card kills me, I will take the card with me. So I can see the players kind of looking at their cards and looking at this enemy, and they see that a really good card is coming up in the deck, and they're saying, it's like, no, you go back to the back of the deck, I don't want you destroyed. No, you stay in there. We're gonna use a crappy card to destroy this enemy. So you'd have to utilize just a little bit more strategy to make sure you don't accidentally destroy the good card combating this type of enemy. So this, I think, is a huge improvement to the left click, drag across the enemy, and that damages the enemy type of combat system. And by the way, the whole left click, drag along the mouse across the enemy was to combat the left clicky nature of like auto clickers, or just the what I find to be the boring part of just left clicking and having the enemy just perform an attack. That I thought was just too boring. There's not a whole lot of strategy to it. This, the way I see it, has strategy. Now, this is gonna piss off a lot of card gamers, because this is like a complete atrocity what a standard card game is all about. I have already gotten so many opinions when I posted about the system, and I don't care. I actually enjoyed this. This is the one of those rare times when I put together a system that is different, that I enjoyed myself. All the crafting stuff, do you know how many games have crafting in them? The crafting mechanics in games are just about the most watered down thing you can ever implement in your game. It's like walking at this point, sprinting, and there's nothing exciting about it. This, however, I was really excited about. I tested around with a few enemies. I think I also want to add some more variety to the way the cards behave in terms of, let's say, blocking. So if you have a card that has a good amount of damage, and then maybe you right click to block an attack from the enemy, the damage rating of that card will determine how well you can deflect the damage of the enemy. If the enemy deals 4 damage, so something like if the enemy deals 4 damage, but you have a 2 damage card in your deck, then you absorb 2 damage, but you also take 2 damage. Something along those lines. I don't know, we have to play around with this yet, but at least from what I've tested with, doing combat with a couple of enemies that are in the game, it felt right. It felt interesting. And as long as it feels interesting to me, that's pretty much the compass that I'm going to be using for the moment. I've already gone through the whole debate when I posted this on the Godot subreddit. People linking, games like Slay the Spire and Darkest Dungeon and whatnot, telling me how the card game system is supposed to be made, and Honestly, this is my criteria. And yes, there's a lot of game developers out there that will use that as an excuse when they're really stubborn about taking feedback, because they don't want to take feedback. They're like, oh, I'm right about everything. This is the way the game is supposed to be made. This is one of those things that I'm really excited about. I genuinely like the way this works, and it makes sense for the way I'm going to be planning out the levels, as this pretty much is going to act as a fundamental building block of how levels are going to become available to the player. So with that fundamental combat system that I actually find enjoyable in the game, I was starting to get kind of burned out. I mean, you've seen the report section of this game. I've made a massive amount of progress on some very important key rudimentary base mechanics without which the game could not exist. Without these things, there's just nothing to play. It is getting to an interesting point where I can start focusing on a variety of enemies, starting adding locations, and adding a bit more bits of narrative of something resembling like an early access campaign. The general approach that I'm going to take with this is to create a short story following the protagonist that will act as early access, and then if people like it, they can pick it up, they can play the story, and that will give me both the time and break and financial resources in order to continue working on the main campaign. So with that being said, why don't we move on to the next project. Guess what, folks? I finally released a game, and it's a piece of shit. To preface this, before we get right into it, I had been severely burned out after the massive amount of progress I made on the Child of Ether project. Like, that combat system was the magnum opus of that particular development cycle. And the development cycle is usually the same. You have a whole bunch of energy, a whole bunch of inspiration, a whole bunch of ideas. You put in mad hours into implementing those ideas. You finish that, you crash and burn, and then you have to step away from the project for a little while. That's burnout. A lot of developers try to work past burnout, or try to deal with burnout, try to mitigate burnout. I embrace that motherfucker like it's a natural component of life, because I know that when I come back to the project, I will have all sorts of brand new ideas that are just going to be absolutely phenomenal. Usually, to compensate for this, you work in a large team where when one person runs out of ideas, another person comes in and they can contribute, and the whole project grows from cooperative experience. If I want to get to that point, I need a team of people that I can actually hire, find a place, establish some sort of a studio, pay them, and then we can have that kind of a process. Until that point, I'm in a solo sphere. I have to rely on just my own creative juices to get this thing through. So the way you do this is, when you burn out, you take a pause. You step away from the project, you leave it on the side, do something else. It could be either a different game, although it would be even better if you quite literally like take a micro vacation, which is, you know, go watch some movies, read some books, play some other games, enjoy yourself and entertain yourself, which is when your brain is going to start absorbing new ideas, or it's going to start absorbing new external stimuli from which new ideas can be created. So in this case, embrace burnout is the general rule of thumb that I've started employing whenever I work on these projects, and it's been working pretty well. Now, this project has been on my hard drive since last year. I haven't come back to this project, and in part because I have a whole bunch of projects that have been far further along developed, and in order to get this project to any sort of a presentable state, I would have had to spend at least like 2 years on it. And that was just... It's getting to the point where I haven't released shit for a while. And with all of the progress I made with Child of Ether, I was due for a bit of a break, a bit of a change of scenery. So I've spent a good like 2 weeks basically just recuperating, so to speak. Enjoying life, watching movies, playing some games, reading some books. And it was when I was going down the nostalgia boulevard and playing some Counter-Strike 1.6 with bots, is when I realized, man, the FPS genre is hella fun. Don't I have an FPS project that I started at some point that I can maybe, focus a little bit for the time being? Just some, dumb FPS thing. No story, no nothing, just something minimal. And then I realized, yes, I do have a project like that. It's the VR shooter that I started almost 2 years ago. So at that point, the wheels were already in motion. I opened up the project and I started working on the VR shooter again. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of what I have done for the project, I've sunk a good 2 months into this, and I've actually just started the whole project from scratch in Godot 4, but I didn't get it to the point where it would be like a standalone campaign experience, and I was starting to get burned out from that as well, which is unfortunately the downside of working by yourself. But this time around, I decided to try and work past the burnout. Not for too long though. That's not really going to lead to any good results one way or another, but I did it specifically up until the point where the game was more or less standalone, where you could play it, you could launch it and play it, and it had some sort of a beginning and an end. I just wanted to push the game to that particular point, which is exactly what I did, and I finished it. To that point, I pushed the game out. It is out there, it is on Steam, it is in the wilderness. To me, actually publishing this, regardless of how shit this game is a monumental checkmark that I can put to my name. Yes, the game is super minimal, and you'll see exactly how minimal it is, but the fact that I actually got it finished is very, very important to me. Because I have hard drives and just folders labeled year after year after year, filled with prototype ideas that I started and never finished. So that is a win in my book, no matter how terrible the game is. And it's kind of terrible, to be honest. You'll see. You'll see. So with that being said, why don't we take a look at what exactly the process for this project was. And right before we begin, I have to note that this project has already eaten up way too much time than I had originally allotted it, and this video includes the time that I'm still giving this project. So, hold on to your tits, we're gonna go through this real quick. I started by writing some sort of a electro house action soundtrack, after which I wrote another soundtrack, and then I topped it all off with another soundtrack. I opened up the last instance of the project, which was made in Godot 3, looked at my existing code base, vomited a little bit in my mouth, and said fuck this. Started a new project in Godot 4, began by establishing our good old usual VR player object, equipped him with a basic set of hands and a basic level to do some tests inside of, put together some quick resemblance of grabbing, made a very rudimentary model of a weapon, given the player the ability to pick up said weapon, then immediately realized the mistake of my ways and recreated the model using simple shapes in Blender, established a quick resemblance of a level playground, imported some of the better assets from the original project, and then proceeded to work on the weapon magazine. Learning from my mistakes of the past iterations of this project, I decided to take a completely modular approach to programming the weapon, where in the past projects I would usually create a separate object with a separate script for each weapon in the game. This time around, every single weapon is actually an inherited class of the base weapon, which simply needs to replace its mesh, its sounds, its rate of fire, and a couple of other variables, and we're good to go. The system allows me to add new weapons to the game extremely effortlessly. As a matter of fact, I can even keep the debug weapons in the game and still add new weapons using proper geometry. We set up a generic magazine object, which acts in the same exact way as the weapon does, allowing us to add new magazines for new weapons as effortlessly as the weapons themselves, made sure that we can actually grab the weapons correctly, and then proceeded to work on the fetching mechanic. It's a little janky right now, but bear with me, we'll get there. Next time I programmed the weapon to have a pullable slide. Again, this is programmed in the generic weapon class, which means every new weapon I add will automatically have this feature built into it. Not only that, since multiple weapons can have multiple gripping zones, since the player can grab them by the handle or the grip, I had to set up multiple collision shapes and give the player hands the ability to determine which one they are grabbing. If the weapon does not feature a gripping zone, we can simply disable the shape for it. Next up, I've discarded the rectangular hands and instead opted in to create an armature featuring a full set of hands. The palms themselves actually came from an earlier earlier build of the project, so didn't have to spend any time on that. And just like that, voila, we can grab the weapon and pull the slide. Next up, I started recreating the key mechanic from the previous build of the game, which is the wrist deployable magazine. You see, a lot of VR shooter games choose to have either a dedicated pouch or a number of pouches within which you can find magazines for the weapon you're holding. Since by this point that particular approach has been tried and tested and boring if I did it again, I decided to make the magazines be deployed from your wrist, making them readily accessible to be reloaded. You see, this entire project is inspired by another VR game called Boneworks. I really like the way the Boneworks handled combat. What I didn't like is how long it took you to reload your weapons. It doesn't matter how much of a John Wick you think you are when you're shooting past those 12 dozens of guards. When you gotta reload that gun, you look like a wacky waving inflatable tube man. The particular focus of this game was to prioritize the fun part, which is the shooty bits. And to make sure that the shooty bits occupy the most of your time, the reloady bits have to be pretty short. Now, it is not to say that reloading isn't fun. Certainly when you're getting shot at, being able to reload quickly and get right back into action is a part of the experience. So the wrist-mounted magazine deployment system is simply there to make sure that the magazine is always within view. You can grab it, pop the empty mag with it, pop it into the weapon, and there you go. The popping out mechanic is actually another genius idea I borrowed from Boneworks. You simply pick up the mag, tap the other mag that's already in the weapon with it, it pops out, you pop the new one in, good to go. Now, I don't think I'm gonna go as far as making an entire inverse kinematic systems for the entire player model, but I did want to have inverse kinematics on the arm so that you can see your wrist. I have previously tested what it's like to have a wrist that's basically a part of your hand, and it would be awkward. With the base weapon scene in place, it was time to add some variety. Now, because of the severe time limitations I've allotted to this project, I bypassed any notion of making highly detailed models or textures. The design rule for this one was to make every weapon look as close to a Roblox dildo as possible without infringing any copyrights. Basic shapes, basic geometry, don't fret too much, don't spend more than an hour on a weapon. I did tell you, this game is a piece of shit. For the extra weapons, I decided to go with an Uzi and a pistol, which were the staple weapons in the first rendition of this project. The process of actually adding these weapons to the game is so abominably straightforward that it actually blew my mind that I didn't do this earlier. Seriously, every weapon is the same weapon. Simply swap out some variables and models and you're done. And yet this was about the time I started hitting some particular technological snags about the way I implemented the slide system. You see, the most egregious issue is that if you hold the weapon with one hand and then try to pull the slide with another hand, then let go of the weapon, your other hand will literally fall with the weapon. And because I'm using Boneworks as my source of inspiration, I really wanted to make sure that the weapons physically interact with the environment, which means I wanted to make sure that the player couldn't just fist the wall and then shoot the enemy through on the other side. Considering how janky Godot's physics system is, it was a tall order, but I was still adamant at reaching some sort of a workable solution. I put together a quick CSG-based object that allowed me to experiment with different joint types. I tried the slide joint, I tried the 6DOF joint, I tried programming in some limitations to make sure that objects don't go past a certain amount, anything to get this thing to work. So to make sure the weapons actually behaved like physical objects, they would have to be made out of physical rigid bodies. And in the end, I did find a solution that allowed me to achieve a normal slide behavior by using a 6DOF joint with some very finely tuned restitution and softness properties. I went ahead and propagated these changes to the other weapons. Next up, I've added the magazine depositing feature, and of course, because the entire weapon is a modular build, all you have to do is just move around a bunch of area nodes and collision shapes. I did a couple of very quick edits for some placeholder sound effects for the slides coming in and out, magazines being dropped. This is where the service called Zapsplat has been absolutely phenomenal at finding the right sounds very quickly, specifically for prototyping purposes. These fuckers aren't sponsoring me, but I still use their service. I've been subscribed to them for over a year at this point. It is an absolute godsend if you're an indie developer and you need to populate sound effects into your game. Let me tell you something. Placing sound effects early in your prototype does wonders with immersion and helping you put yourself into the game and figuring out what you want to do from that point on. Being able to hear your game early on, even if it's placeholder sounds, does wonders. Little tidbit of information I learned from one of the GDC talks on sound effects. Alright, it ain't a shooter if you ain't got something to shoot at. So I went ahead and put together a first enemy of this game, which is a capsule suppressor. Essentially, it's a robot that is surrounded by a bunch of shielding plates, and you're supposed to shoot off the shielding before you can actually damage the robot itself. This took a little bit of figuring out because at one point it's a kinematic body, but at another point it's a rigid body, because when you shoot it, it's supposed to tumble down, but when it moves around, it's supposed to just stay upright. Initially, I made it into a kinematic body which contained the rigid body as a child, so when it's alive, it moves around as a kinematic body, but when it's dead, it turns off the kinematic body collision shapes and enables the rigid body behavior. But then I realized I could just use a rigid body and lock its rotation axis and simply made the character move that way. I made a bunch of very quick placeholder materials so I can color code things like interactable objects, enemies, and kiosks. Of course, if these enemies cannot make their way to me and kick my ass, it's not exactly much of a challenge, so a little bit of pathfinding was my next step. Now, where the hell are these enemies supposed to come from? Why, enemy spawners, of course. This is a particular idea I borrowed from one of my earlier prototypes for a game called Dream Team Theater, which is supposed to be kind of like a Nazi zombie-ish type wave survival game, which you may or may not have seen me work in Godot 3 way back a few years ago. Essentially, it's a simple elevator type capsule. The sliding door rotates around the capsule and the enemy comes out of it. This is about the point when I started thinking, what the hell is this game even gonna be? And this is also the point when I started feeling a little bit of that burnout. So I had to very quickly figure out what the hell this game even is, how you're supposed to play it. There is a campaign component, there is a story component, but there's no way in hell I can actually achieve it in this particular session before I hit burnout. So I decided on the good old standard Waves Hordes mode. Again, my primary concern here is not so much making a very polished game, but making sure this thing doesn't rot on my hard drive again for another year. Besides, having a Waves mode will allow me to focus on doing things like additional features, AI, gameplay mechanics, and the Zombies mode in Boneworks was one of the staples of that project, but the developers have kind of abandoned and moved on to the next rendition because, of course, they did. You know, who wants to focus too much on the fun parts of the game? I kid, whatever their reasons for, moving on to Bone Lab is, it's their business, but I do wish that the Zombies mode had been paid a lot more attention in the Boneworks project. Now, it wasn't until I got the enemy spawners in that I realized that this is way too hard. Like, the first enemy, requiring you to shoot off a bunch of panels before you can damage it, made that enemy a bit more tough and resilient than I had originally anticipated. So off I go making another enemy, I guess. This particular enemy I decided to name Fodder, as in cannon fodder, as in the most basic bitch kind of enemy you can have in the game. It's quite literally just a box. Again, I'm starting to feel like I'm running out of fuel in this project, and there's no way in hell I'm gonna let it sit on my hard drive for another 2 years. Whatever the hell happens, I committed to do the good old push, honey, push to get this thing in and out the door as soon as possible. The base enemy has been tested, it works as intended, so I decided to focus a little bit on the communication of the game. Primarily, there are 3 key variables the player has to worry about: their health, their bullets, and their gears. Health is self-explanatory, bullets are self-explanatory. What the hell are gears? Well, gears are essentially your resource that you spend on weapons, doors, unlockables, yada yada yada. Effectively, it is your in-game currency. The key is to communicate how much of it you have. So I had put together a quick janky looking holographic display that shows you all 3 pieces of information. After that, I played around with a little bit of alignments of hands to weapons, albeit the hands did miss a bunch of gestures that would make this a lot easier. And because this was a simple waves mode, I wanted to communicate to the player what wave they're on, how many enemies are left, yada yada yada. And for that, I decided to go with yet another holographic display attached to their forearm. Now, we got the enemies, we got the weapons, we got the UI. How the hell is the player supposed to be able to interact with the game modes? Why, of course, this would be a job for some sort of a computerized kiosk. I put together a quick and easy modular menu object, which allows me to specify a list of different menu options. After the menu options are populated into an export variable in this menu, upon runtime, the menu will populate all the buttons for each and every menu selection, at which point the player will be able to interact with the kiosk. Nothing special here, just a little ray pointing out of the wrist of the hand. When the ray detects one of the buttons, it tells the buttons to light up, and when the player presses the trigger, it tells the button to trigger. Again, fellas, I'm starting to run on fumes here, so this is not about the time to start experimenting. I put together a very quick kiosk resembling object out of CSG boxes, and then came the question of where the hell is the player supposed to get his ammunition and health from? I mean, obviously we can't have the player just start with 100 health and whatever goes goes. So I decided to put together a very quick, very janky looking dispenser for either health or ammo. The thing is pretty straightforward. Walk up, press a button, something pops up. Next, I moved on to another feature which I would consider to be a major staple of this particular project, which is a wrist-mounted shotgun. This is a little quirk I've borrowed from an anime called Ghost in the Shell, where this character named Bato literally has a concealed shotgun within his lower forearm. This is supposed to be used as a last resort when you're in the middle of a firefight and you run out of ammo, and there's this bold motherfucker for a garden shield for a hand running after your ass all lustful-like. So after a little bit of modeling of the wrist-mounted shotgun, I ran into another problem. You see, because the wrist-mounted shotgun and the ammo dispenser are technically a part of the same armature, I now have an issue where I can only play one animation at a time, which means the animation to deploy a magazine will be conflicting with the animation to deploy the shotgun. I did not want to impose that limit. The logical solution to this would be used an animation tree feature in Godot Engine. Except, oh my god, what a pain in the ass the animation tree is. You see, the biggest problem I've encountered with the animation tree is that when you're trying to define a particular node that plays only one part of the animation, there's no way to tell that node to only affect a particular set of bones. It's gonna affect all the bones. So now you have to route that node through another node that's supposed to do filtering as some sort of a byproduct. It's not even what that node is meant for, and only then, through some sheer magic unicorn fuckery, you're actually gonna be able to route the two animations separately. But not until you adjust all the beginning frames in both the bones in both animations that have nothing to do with one another to assume the initial position at the beginning of each frame. And all of that nonsense could have been avoided very easily if the play animation node had contained a little filter button, just like a bunch of other nodes do. Tell this animation node only affect these types of bones, don't affect the other ones, we're done. When I had posted that suggestion showcasing the use cases on the Godot Engine's feature suggestions part on the GitHub, I was promptly told to go fuck myself, not literally, but unfortunately my experience with feature suggestions have been so far is that if you can't program them yourself, don't offer feature suggestions. Unfortunately, as of late, I started noticing a particular trend in the development community, and it's the fact that when you're simply a developer of games, not software or engines, if you offer a feature suggestion, they will tell you either to implement it yourself or go take a hike. Seriously, we had a recording session using OBS recently, and we lost about 2 hours of footage because OBS doesn't have a feature that detects if your video stream has frozen. Guess what? When you're sitting there recording and playing a game and has OBS open on the side, you don't have the time to look at OBS to check on it. I went ahead and posted that little feature suggestion, something that seemingly is very innocuous: detect if the stream is frozen, have a flashing warning to the user so we don't record for the next 2 hours with a frozen screen. And shortly after posting the suggestion, I was promptly told to go fuck myself. Maybe not by the developers themselves, but certainly by some sort of hotshot programmer. On the Godot developer side, they may not be using such harsh language, but every time you post a feature suggestion, the first comment says, "Do you have a code example for us?" And I think what the developers of these open source projects have to realize is that not every user of their software is a software developer themselves. I would probably say I'm fairly versed in GDScript to create my own games, and yet at the same time, I know fuck all about C++. I cannot open the Godot Engine source code and make my way around it. We are not software developers, we are users, but we sometimes have ideas for features that might actually benefit us. But this has turned too much of a rant as it is already, so let's move on. Another resource added to the project is a medkit, and then of course a corresponding dispenser for said medkits. Then try to at least add a hint of polish to what little the weapons are by adding a muzzle flash. Then I went back to the concept of resources and realized that I now have 3 separate scripts with 3 separate resources, and we can't have that now, can we? The very idea goes against our modular programming approach. So I scrapped the extra resources, recreated them from inheriting the initial resource, and now we have one that rules them all. Anytime I need a new resource, simply inherit from the first original scene, replace the model, replace the type of resource from an export variable, and we're done. Also, I made sure that every resource has a little 3D label that represents how much of that resource is still in there. Boy, could I have used that 3D label when I was working on the Dream Team Theater project with the little damage markers above the enemies. At this point, however, I was progressing well into burnout. I was no longer running on fumes, I was running on farts. So it is time to get this thing wrapped up as quickly as possible, and then I realized the players have no idea how to play this freaking game. So I started by quickly putting together a splash screen displaying my studio logo and studio intro video that I made all the way back in 2012. I refused to make a new one until I used this one at least a few times. God damn it, I was proud of that intro back then, and I'm still proud of it now. It will live out in at least a few of my projects before I make a new one. This is where I realized that Godot Engine's video playback capabilities had somehow regressed in Godot 4. We used to have the ability to play both WebP and OGV file formats within the video player node. However, apparently Godot Engine was struggling with WebP format. I had no problem using it when I was putting in the video intros in my other projects, but apparently the Godot gods have said no, we cannot have that. You have to stick to the OGV format, which is such a pain in the ass to convert. The FFmpeg file converter, which is a command line based tool for converting media, struggles so much with OGV format. No matter how I played around with the settings, I would always end up with a glitchy, buggy mess. The only way I managed to actually convert that format was by using some sort of bullshit online video converter service, which means that my studio intro is now somewhere on the cloud server being used to train some bullshit AI. Yeah, good luck with that. So, with the studio intro in place, I had made a terrible realization. and it's the fact that none of my enemies are actually attacking the player. They have no capabilities of actually dealing damage, which effectively eliminates them from being an actual threat. So we just roll back a little bit, spend a little bit of time, give the projectile to the capsule enemy, give the proximity damage to the fodder enemy, and good. Okay. We're good to move on. So by this point, you have pretty much seen everything there is to this game. It is a piece of shit, but it is a piece of shit that I'm relatively proud of, solely for the fact that I've been able to push it out to Steam before I hit complete burnout. Now, because we still have to make the tutorial and we still have to teach the player how to play the damn game, I decided to put together a very quick character that I have voiced myself, guiding the player through the ropes of basic gameplay. Things like fetching weapons, holstering them into holster zones, firing, reloading, fetching resources, purchasing ammunition, giving them a little bit of a sandbox to play around with the existing enemies, and injecting a little bit of a narrative sub-story of why this game is such a piece of shit. To prevent an average Joe Schmo from mistaking this for an actual good time, I've actually priced the game at $45. Nobody is going to look at this trailer and think that this is worth $45. The job of this game is to serve as a checkpoint in my life. I am still capable of releasing stuff, no matter how bad it is. Now, in hindsight, I spent way too much time and effort on this tutorial segment for something that is supposed to be a throwaway tutorial to be remade at a later time. Having done this, I realized I could have communicated the same exact information just as well with a couple of text boxes and screenshots indicating which buttons on the controller to press and what they did. But no, I decided to go with a freaking voice-acted character that has to be animated from point to point, detecting if the player has finished the task, moving them on to the next element, having the lights turn on and off as they go through the corridors. Why? I don't know. We'll chalk it up to experience. At least I got to animate a character. So, with the tutorial segment finally done, I was finally ready to push honey push. I quickly put together the storefront page, which, if you're trying to schedule stuff, make sure you account for at least a day or two of putting together the web store page, because oh boy, does it take a lot of resources. Capsules, thumbnails, backgrounds, logos, all sorts of resources, all sorts of screenshots and trailers. All of those things are mandatory before you can even think about publishing this thing to Steam. But it's done. It is there. I can move on. To wrap this segment up, I'm going to show you the quick impromptu trailer I had put together to very clearly showcase what this game is and make sure the players are sufficiently deterred from spending any money on it. Last but not least on this progress report is Artag Rise. Currently on the chopping block is pretty much everything that has to do with delivering the story. And the feature in question is technically a fairly simple one, which is just a fade to white, transition to another level, fade back out, with some sort of a title being displayed in front. Now, I'm trying to keep this as modular as possible and programming the fade transition in a way that is, well, reusable in as many cases as possible, which granted takes a little bit more work to make sure that you account for all different possible scenarios, like how fast you want the fade in to be, how fast you want fade out to be, how long you want it to pause, how long you want the title screen to stay on. If there was only one transition like this ever, I could just animate it in the animation player and be done with it. But if there's one thing that I learned that really grinds my gears in indie game dev, is making single-use systems. Anything that has only one single use in it in the entire game just immediately makes me want to pull it up and toss it out. So even if it's something as stupid simple as a screen transition, I try to think, maybe there's other places where I can use this, and then try as hard as I can to take a modular approach to programming that feature. In this case, this innocuous fade transition has turned into essentially a single function call that allows me to define things like the color of the transition, the duration of the transition, the duration of the pause, the duration of the fade in for the text, the duration of how long the text stays on the screen, the duration of how fast the text disappears from the screen, and then the duration of the fade out. All confined within one single function. All you gotta do is pop in those values, including the string that's supposed to appear on the screen, and then that's it. The worst part of all is that when you start programming the actual narrative bits into the program, you start encountering a lot of these single use case scenarios. And what I've learned is that it's exactly those types of features that start becoming a real time sink. Next up, I went through the list of recordings that Tim and I have done for our characters, and I've populated the references to those recordings into the dialogue builder. You guys might have seen this dialogue builder be featured in a couple of my videos before. Essentially, it's a very simple web-based dialogue tree builder that I've built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and I made it a part of the Concept Bay website, so you can actually go there and just use it. It's basically there. No payment, no access needed, it's just there. I've already used this in projects like Child of Ether, this one, Artag Rise, and I'm definitely going to be using it a heck of a lot in the Atomicon project. I've programmed this dialogue builder to offer a slew of standard dialogue messages that you would usually find in really any RPG game. Things like a regular message, a randomly chosen message, a choice that the player has to make, the NPC giving quests, checking quests, marking quests as completed or failed or pending, giving items, taking items, putting flags into the player for, say, mentioning that you visited this location or you've talked to this character, having little flags, giving, checking, and marking tasks for the quests, giving monetary reward. Just a whole bunch of stuff that you might want to implement into your game. And granted, not every game has to use every single one of those messages. You only use the stuff that you know you're gonna need. When you're done building out your dialogue, it spits out a standard JSON file, which you can then program your game to open and then go through the dialogue messages. And what I've been doing here is mentioning all of the audio recordings that are supposed to be correspondent to each of the dialogue message. Now, since we're starting to deal with things like dialogue, written text, and vocal recordings, I am trying to think ahead and consider localization to be something I'll have to deal with later. So the way I think I'm going to go about doing localization is this JSON file is effectively say the English language JSON file. If I want to make, let's say, a Spanish version or German version or Russian version, all that is technically required is to choose a different JSON file. That's pretty much all that it takes. Load a different JSON file, you now have a different language. Now, what about the vocal recordings? Because all I'm doing here is I'm mentioning the name of the audio file that contains the vocal recording. But, okay, so what about the vocal recordings? Well, that is actually just as simple. If you noticed, I only mentioned the name of the audio recording, the audio file itself, and not the entire path to the file. In order to locate this particular audio recording, my project is going to dive into the audio folder, which is predetermined, it's always in the same location. Then it's going to dive into the language folder, and then within that language folder you have chapters, and within chapters you have the audio recordings. So in that entire path, the only thing that has to change is the name of the folder with the language. That is all the requirement there is for localization. Pick a different JSON file for different written language, pick a different folder for the audio language. Now, I have seen Godot Engine's own localization tools. They look interesting, but they cannot help me on the dialogue front on the sort of scale that I'm trying to implement this in. It would be great for small resources like menu names and tab names and small description pieces of text, but when it comes to big, lengthy dialogues, I would rather go with a custom solution, which, hey, Godot Engine gives us all the tools we need to build them, so there you go. Now, this particular level is actually the very first thing that the players are going to see when they enter the campaign. Prior to this, there's a few tutorial levels to teach them how to play the basic mechanics, but for the most part, this is how the story starts. This is the first level, and this is how the story starts. So this level culminates in an explosion that teleports the players to a different point on an island, and this is where I need to start putting the level onto which the players get spit out on. As soon as the level loads, it's supposed to play a bit of a cutscene during which the players get to calm down a little bit. And during these post-action calm times, it's usually the best place to deliver a bit more of your narrative. And it just so happens to be one of those single-use type things. Literally nothing in this sequence I can reuse for, I don't know, a different location. So you can imagine putting these sort of single-use cases isn't too thrilling. Every damn time I gotta put one of these unique things, I feel like... I mean, no wonder AAA studios are doing all this multiplayer shit. Every single feature is used and reused to death. Now, I talked about this a little while before, but my development approach to this particular project is going through a few changes. I'm trying to minimize on the amount of special effects and polish too early on, and I'm trying to only focus on, say, the core features, like getting the characters to move from this location to this location, maybe play just a simple walk cycle animation, put together some quick placeholder particles just to indicate that they where they appear from. They get teleported from the middle of nowhere, so little explosion of some wiggly white bits. Since the goal is basically just to finish the cutscene, do it as fast as possible. Worry about polish afterwards. I haven't done a lot of cutscenes in Godot Engine because most of my projects have actually been pretty modular. So when it comes to a cutscene, I figured let's play around with some particles and see if we can make it look like the characters are hitting the ground and then uprooting the soil, and the teleport explosion is at least somehow communicated. The biggest challenge was to connect the cutscene with the actual players so that when the cutscene ends, the players get to actually play the game. So I figured I'm gonna have to do a lot in terms of modifying the player object to make it so that it's cutscene friendly, so that the animation player node is capable of swapping out the various animations and various sprites, and at the same time make sure that when we release the players from the cutscene mode, they actually regain control and they can jump around and move about the level. And I decided to not do that, and I quite literally just popped in a couple of sprites that use the player sprite. I swapped their animations quite literally in real time, and when the cutscene ends, screen cuts to black, fades back out, and during that blackness period, that's when I spawn in the player models, the actual player objects. Which, you know what? It works, and it doesn't look horrendous. And this is a solution that I've seen in a number of games, but it never dawned on me that that's likely the purpose of why they cut to black after the cutscene. They cut to black so that they can swap out the camera position, place in the player objects, and then hide all the cutscene stuff. And to the player, it doesn't really look like, well, like anything. It looks like, oh, that's how they end cutscenes. But no, there's stuff happening in the background. I started blocking out this level, tried to make something vertical, make it so that the players have some fun time jumping around and wall jumping and parkouring all over this place. This is supposed to be a fairly ambient section of the game where the characters kind of work out their current stances on the situation, have a bit of a back and forth dialogue, the conflict gets progressed a little bit forward. Now, these are pretty large levels with predominantly nothing happening in them at the moment. My goal is to populate the level with a number of collectibles, a number of pickups that will help the player progress the game forward or clear certain challenges a little bit easier. For example, there's a particular resource that the player can pick up, which are data fragments. They float around all over the level. Player picks them up and they can use those data fragments in order to open up certain passages, unlocking additional levels, and by offering some sort of a reward for collecting them, I give those things value, which means I now have this tiny little collectible that I can repurpose to give more sustenance to a large level like this. Otherwise, it's all just empty space. What I'm going to try to do is reward the player with more of the game content, more of the game lore delivered through some quests. Because honestly, I am a huge fan of narrative games, and I think that the best way to reward the player is to give them more of the story, more of the world, more of the characters, more of the drama. I got an idea for a new type of obstacle, which is a temporary platform. You guys have seen this thing. It's a pretty common thing you can find in a lot of platformers. It's either like a crumbling platform or a platform that falls down after half a second when the player stands on it. And in this particular case, I decided to make a platform that pops in and out on a timer. As a matter of fact, the whole timer thing is optional. Through the magical use of export variables, I can make this platform either be stationary or it can have a timer on it that makes it collapse after a certain amount of time. I gotta say, I started using Blender quite a bit more for creating assets for this game because this game is kind of low res, but it's not really pixel art because of how far the camera is away from the characters. So when I create a 3D model and I render it in a fairly low resolution, it doesn't look too out of place. Like, you can tell that it looks a bit different from the surrounding environment, but somehow I don't personally see that it's too far out of place. Maybe it's because I've gotten used to seeing some 3D assets in this 2D game, but honestly, it helps a lot in terms of very quickly putting together some sort of an asset that has an animation to it, flips up or down, has a bit of a movement to it. That would be kind of a pain in the ass and a time hog to hand animate, so if it works, it works. I try to think ahead to make sure that this object can be controlled by a variety of sources like consoles, switches, scripted events, cutscenes. So this flippable platform quite literally has a trigger function or a toggle function, and essentially it just waits for some other object to tell it to open or close. To make the player fall through it when it's closed, I just disable the collision shape on it, and that's it. I made use of the exact same approach when designing this bulk door. At this point, it's just another obstacle the players have to overcome. Now, the curious thing is that this game is two-dimensional, but this door wouldn't really read very well if I just displayed it from the side. If it was being displayed from the front, like a door in the wall, then that would be fine, but in this case I wanted the player to progress to the right instead of into the cliffside. So to make this door actually read more like a door rather than just sort of a pillar, I ever so lightly tilted the door to reveal its front. But this of course presents a problem that technically now the player can both be in front of the door and behind the door. So what I've done to fix this is go back to Blender and use the Blender's camera clipping plane, the two settings you can define how far back and how close to the camera things actually get rendered, and I adjusted the clipping plane just enough to cut off the backside of the door and then render that part of the frame as a separate sprite, and then did the opposite where you can only see the backside of the door, rendered that as a separate plane, reassembled it in Godot, and assigned each part of the frame a separate depth, which is something you can do using the Z-index property. Now the challenge on this particular level is you have to locate a number of generators, start them all up in order to be able to open up the door. But at this point, we already have the fundamental structure of triggering objects, which is any object that can be triggered has a function called trigger, and then any object that can trigger other objects like switches, consoles, levers, anything you can press on and interact with, that simply has a target node, an export variable that allows you to say whom are we going to be triggering. But if I wire up a button directly to the door, then you can just flip that button and open up the door. No need for messing around with generators. So this is where I realized that not only do we need to be able to trigger something, but we also need to know if we can trigger something, based on, say, if there's power. Now, at this juncture, I don't know if this may have been the best way to handle it, but I quite literally decided to add an extra property to a lot of these interactable objects called powered. By default, it is basically an export variable, and by default it is set to true, so most things are pre-programmed to not require any sort of power to be able to interact with them. But by toggling that export variable off, I can have generators that are scattered all over the level that are quite literally targeting some sort of a node and telling that node whether it is powered or not, which of course in turn determines whether or not something happens when you interact with it. So what I've put together here is a bit of a conduit that has a number of lights on it indicating how many power sources you're supposed to enable. In this case, for now, all the power sources have to be located within the same level because they are all going to be interacted with by the player, and they will have to tell some other object you are now powered. The number of lights on the generator, of course, is dynamic based on an export variable, which means I can have this thing in the level requiring 2 flips or 2 power sources, maybe 5 power sources, maybe 7, maybe 10. Again, modular approach, yada yada yada, trying to account for multiple use cases. Once this conduit detects that all of the power sources have been enabled, it is going to power up the switch, and when you interact with the switch, it opens up the door. Honestly, I'm pretty sure there was an easier way to go about it, but I just kind of went with it. But I'm no stranger of rewriting certain systems if they feel too janky when I use them. Speaking of things being powered, another prop I thought might be kind of cool is a breaker switch. Just a nice old school, big honking 3-phase lever you gotta pull down, straight from the Iron Giant. This allows me to place these things in between the power source and the thing being powered, and the players would have to go around and locate where these switches are and make sure that they're actually powered. The switch lever itself has a light on it indicating if it is receiving power, so there is some level of communication to the player. And again, in the whole modular approach, the light itself is actually a separate scene that I have placed and instanced within the conduit that counts how many power sources you've enabled. I just took that light, popped it into the switch, and then done. Again, trying to minimize the amount of time I spend on these trivial things, so if I have a light that is very easy to turn on and off and I can reuse all over the levels, not to mention that once the player sees that light and sees its purpose once, they'll recognize it in all the other places, then why not? Might as well. Now, this part was technically unnecessary, but I decided to use Line2D nodes in order to connect cables, show that cables are connected to this conduit, communicating that, hey, you gotta go ahead and fix this up. What I didn't expect is to find that Line2Ds don't have Bezier tools in them, so you cannot make nice, smooth lines. Why? Why? That actually made no sense. If you want to be able to draw lines, which the Line2D node is quite literally meant for, it has all sorts of stuff. You can do round caps, you can do multicolors, you can do outline and inner shading, but you cannot do Bezier curves? I mean, it makes sense to use a nice Line2D node to display wires and cables, right? Do you need to have a separate sprite for every single cable segment? I mean, you could, but if it's just a simple cable, it makes sense to use something simple like a Line2D. Godot's no stranger to Bezier curves. I mean, the animation player uses Bezier curves. I believe there's even another node, the Path2D node. Path2D node has Bezier curves. Why doesn't the line have Bezier curves? I posted this. I posted this on the Godot feature suggestions, and I was promptly told to go fuck myself. Not actually, but they basically said, you want Bezier curves, go program them yourself. So, you know, I guess if you're not a core developer, don't bother posting suggestions. In the end, if I use enough segments, I can simulate the behavior of Bezier curves. It would be very time consuming, but I don't really have a whole lot of other ways to do it. I mean, honestly, how long would it really take to implement it? I mean, honestly, how long would it really take to implement Bezier curves for the Line2D node? Come on. That's when I started getting all suggestions, like, oh, use a Path2D node, and then write a piece of code that's gonna go along the Path2D node, and then plot out the Line2D. It's like, yes, okay, sure, but now you're using Path2D node for something that a Line2D could have done just as easily. I started putting together the next level, and at this point, it's kind of half autonomous. I'm trying to think of interesting twists and turns and interesting mechanics to put into the game. One of which actually happened to be a mid-air jump prop. In a nutshell, it's a simple prop that's suspended in the middle of the air, and when the player touches it, their jump count gets reset. You can kind of sort of think of it as parkour in 2D. There's a piece of concrete slab, and then you kind of kick off of it, and that gives you an extra jump. And if you cascade these things all through the level, you can now have a gameplay segment where the players have to continuously jump between these two blocks, because of course if they don't, they'll just fall straight down to their deaths. Again, since we're kind of prototyping this feature to save up on, I 3D modeled a piece of concrete slab with a bunch of like staircase pieces onto it. I tried coloring the ladder in such a way that it's easily discernible, and because these things are not really supposed to just stay suspended in midair, they're actually being held together by a number of cables that are attached to various points in the level. Now, resetting the player's jumps wasn't exactly a difficult thing to do, so I decided to make the platform offer the player some sort of feedback on whether or not they have successfully jumped off of it through a little back and forth wiggle. Now, this did present a bit of an issue because in order to make the platform wiggle, the cables that are holding the platform would have to follow the actual wiggle. I mean, technically they don't have to, but it would look nice if they did. So what started as a relatively simple prop kind of turned into this convoluted process of calculating the beginning of the line. I used line 2Ds in order to represent the trusses that are holding up this piece of concrete. The code had to figure out where's the beginning of the truss, where's the end of the truss. It had to pre-calculate where on the actual piece of concrete the wire was connected to it, so that when the piece of concrete wiggles left and right, the wire actually maintains its relative position to that point. And if I remember correctly, I couldn't place the actual wires as a child of this piece of concrete, because if the whole piece of concrete wiggled, the entire wire wiggled with it. Now, mind you, this is before I discovered about top level property, which is a property that you can set that allows you to say, oh yeah, you're a child of me, but you are not going to be inheriting my transforms. So if I rotate or move around or scale, you're not going to rotate, move around, or scale, even though you are a child of me. That property alone is such a huge help. I can think of so many features that I've programmed in the past where I would quite literally take the object, pop it as a child of this instance, and then I would have to program it to then take the child, remove it from itself, but keep the reference to it so that it can move around and use that object, but not affect its transforms, literally by removing it. It worked, but I dreaded every other instance where I would have to employ that exact workaround. So, you know, kudos to Godot developers. It's a good job when it's a good job. You know, I gotta say, it's curious, but I wouldn't ever really address, say, Unreal developers or Unity developers or even GameMaker developers in the same way I address Godot developers, because it just, I don't know. When I look at Unreal and Unity, all I see is the corporation, and then, you know, you're not really talking to anyone personal there. But it just feels a little bit different with Godot. So with this mid-air kickoff platform finished, it was actually time to make use of it in a much larger setting, which took place in the same level. And immediately, as soon as I placed it in the level and then put together some sort of a little platforming segment, I realized that this is going to be such a pain in the ass if there's some sort of a time-critical event that has to take place, like a timer. So immediately after I finished this, I put in a new object, which is a timer switch. And yet again, thanks to Blender, I was able to put together some quick prototype for an object, make a large enough screen to see the numbers, rendered it out, popped into Godot Engine, made a new scene for it. And this object is extremely simple in its nature. You run up to it, click interact, it toggles something on somewhere in the level. You can set whatever that thing is, and then the timer starts rolling. When the timer runs out, it untoggles whatever it targets. So a stupidly dumb, simple mechanic, but you can do so much with it. Like, one thing that just came to mind is having a level where you have a number of these switches, but they all have different times. And your job is to figure out what proper order you need to flip these switches so that the doors, let's say all 3 gates or all 3 doors, remain open so you can go through them in time. You can even time it in just the right way so that when the player reaches the doors, as they're passing through each of the doors, they're just snapping behind them. So having done that, it was around this time when I tried to set up some sort of a development habit. You see, this game is pretty much all dependent on having all sorts of interesting levels, all sorts of interesting obstacles and platforming challenges to overcome. Those levels have to be built. There's really only two types of levels. You have action levels and you have ambient levels, which also happen to be levels where you can traverse between different zones of the game, which are usually referred to as hub worlds or hub levels. The hub levels are nice, calm, ambient levels where you can talk to characters, submit finished quests, talk to other characters and NPCs to acquire new quests, have the story and the main conflict progress forward. And of course, when you get the quest and you embark on that quest, you start going through the challenge levels, the action levels. And for a platformer game like this, there's gotta be a lot of platforming levels, since after the story, that's the main meat and potatoes of a platforming game. So because I have this monumental task of making an obscenely large amount of levels for this game, I tried to establish a daily habit. Bright and early in the morning after my daily routine, make a cup of joe and put together anywhere between maybe 2 to 5 simple levels. That's basically it. The levels would include absolutely no polish whatsoever. They would only include the tile map, the player spawn point, the player exit point, and the challenges. From a basic mathematical standpoint, even if I only make one level a day, which usually takes around maybe 30-ish minutes to maybe an hour, I figured even with basic math, even if I made only one level a day, in a month I have 30 levels. In 2 months, I have 60. In 3 months, I have 90. If I make 3 levels a day, then in mere 3 months, I have 270 levels. And the methodology behind these levels is fairly straightforward. You introduce some sort of a new piece of mechanic, and then for the next, let's say, 5 or 7 levels, you let the player experience that mechanic. Let them probe it from various challenges. Then you start mixing in additional mechanics that you've previously introduced to spice up the gameplay. Maybe every 10 levels or so, there's no real rule behind it, you introduce a new mechanic or a new unique approach to an existing one. If I adhere to this very simple regime, I would be able to amass quite a decent amount of gameplay content from a week-to-week basis. And now, because building levels is something that's kind of mundane, to be honest, you're not really programming anything new. You're quite literally just reusing all the same assets that you've used in the past. I decided that it's not really going to be beneficial for me to record the development process for me making levels. The only time I would record from this point on is anytime there's a bug that needs fixing and anytime there's a new feature that needs to be programmed. Even so much as if there is a level that has to involve some dialogue, that part would be recorded. Everything but the daily grind of just making levels. So the new mechanic that I've introduced in this particular level is, well, one that's pretty much present in every platformer out there, which is a big honkin' saw blade that is following some sort of a rail. For this one, it was basically a symmetrical shape, so I used Krita with the multi-brush tool to create a saw blade design, and also I created a very simple tile for placing down the actual rails. I've also decided to redesign something that has been in the game for a really long time, but has always looked kind of janky, and that would be the basic set of spikes. I don't know why, but I could never get the spikes to really pop, to really stand out, and it was pretty much because I kept using the same exact boring gray color that the surrounding concrete tile was already using. This is one of those cases when you design some sort of an asset and then don't even think about it for the next 2 or 3 years. You look at it real close and think to yourself, what the hell was I thinking? Bright orange, rusty ass spikes, that's all that I need. As soon as I did that, the spikes immediately popped. You can very clearly see them in a variety of lighting situations. It was so simple, yet why did it take me so many years to just do it? I think maybe scale wasn't something that I considered. I kept making my spikes way too small, and when you make orange, rusty spikes that are already really small and the camera is already really far back, it doesn't really read very well. This time around, the spike is just 3 triangles. That's it. It works, it gets the job done. We can finally move on. I reprogrammed the elevator prop a little bit, gave it a light, made sure that it casts nice shadows. And then to give myself yet another vector to spice up the gameplay, I've implemented the power setting, the power feature, into the exit elevator as well. So now the elevator doesn't just sit there, and as soon as the player reaches it, it just teleports them to the next level. Now, I could optionally make it so that the elevator's powered off, and then you have to find a switch in some sort of hard-to-reach area where you have to toggle it, and only then the elevator will turn on. In this level, I placed the power switch underneath the tile and hid it behind a set of laser beams. Now, realistically, to turn off the laser beams, you flip the switch, and then to turn on the elevator, you flip the lever. Could they not have technically be done with the same switch prop? Why do I have to have two different switches that seemingly turn things on and off? Well, the reason being is because, shut up, but more importantly, I think there is a legitimate reason. The concept of power, or powering things on and off, is one concept. Interacting with things is another concept. I wanted to separate the two concepts from one another by clearly designing an interactable little switch that the player can use to interact with whatever in-game objects, and the switch that provides power to something is a totally separate concept represented by a much larger, bulkier, older-looking switch. At this point, it's all about communication, and I wanted to drive the difference between interacting with something and powering something. Because you could have some sort of a passive elevator that goes up and down, or maybe even some sort of a moving platform that goes up and down, and you don't have to interact with it, you just have to give power to it. So there are certain passive mechanics that are just there, they're always running as long as they're given power. Meanwhile, you have other props like laser beams that can be turned on and off, flipping platforms that can be retracted or collapsed. Those things the player has to actively interact with. So by establishing two visually distinct props, hopefully I can communicate that difference to the player. You can still interact with something if it doesn't have power, but it's not going to do anything. In the end, minimizing the confusion is pretty much all about effective communication. All right, now, some of you may know that this project was originally started in GameMaker Studio, like way back, and then when I have been blessed with a demonstration of everything that Godot can offer, I realized that it's gonna be a lot less straining if I just bite the bullet and port the project over to Godot and just continue working from there. Unfortunately, this meant that I had to lose a whole bunch of levels that I had made in the original GameMaker Studio project, because there's no real way to like port over a level from one to another. And even if I did, it wouldn't really help much, because I had reprogrammed the player from scratch in Godot, and I had given the player a slightly more floaty feel to allow the player to overcome much larger distances with a single jump, which gave it more sense of freedom, and I really like that. So I would not even be able to reuse those old levels even if I wanted to, because where some jump was a challenge in GameMaker Studio would now be a breeze for the player in Godot. But it didn't stop me from trying to recreate some of the levels with maybe larger gaps to compensate, and that's exactly what I did for this level. There's an exit elevator that you see as soon as you spawn into the game, but it is locked away behind a laser beam. So what you need to do is turn off the laser beam. You hop across a number of platforms over to the other side of the level, flip a switch. However, as soon as you flip a switch, the horizontal long laser beam automatically engages. And now we have a problem. This is where I had to modify the code of the laser beam in order to give back the feature that it used to have in the GameMaker Studio version of the project, which is having the laser beam toggle itself on and off over certain periods of time. So I gave it two export variables, which contain two time frames: the amount of time the laser beam is on, the amount of time that it is off. And the job of the player is to time their jumps in just the right way so that they can jump over the large hump before the laser beam comes back and destroys them. They make that hop a number of times and they're in the clear. Next up, another good old classic feature of platforming games: spinning saws. Again, trying to think ahead and trying to put together the object in the most modular and reusable way possible. The spinning object is actually a whole separate scene that simply contains a one export variable that tells us how fast it spins around. The saw blades being used in this one are literally the same saw blades we made just a little while ago for the saws on rails. This is where I forgot to mention that the saws themselves aren't actually following the path, because I wanted to make sure that you can use those saws as stationary obstacles as well. So instead I programmed a separate scene, which is basically just a path follower with a little script and a little export variable that allows us to say how fast this path follower following the path, at which point we can reuse this in as many scenarios as we can, place any number of path 2Ds, instance a new path follower inside of them, set their speed, and then instance a new saw blade, which is a totally separate scene, into that path follower, and we're done. Essentially same thing happened here, except no path followers, just a spinner and a saw blade. I did put together a quick sprite which is supposed to be used as a beam that technically connects the saw blades to the center axis, as well as some sort of a, well, central axis sprite indicating where everything is connected and what everything revolves around. The wild thing is that you can nest these things as much as you want. You can have a spinning saw blade at the tip of which there's another spinning saw blade, and whew, you can do all sorts of wild stuff. As a matter of fact, maybe I should write that down. Kind of want to do that. Now, it was around this time when I have come across a very weird bug. Sometimes you get those. It's the kind of bug that doesn't make itself apparent until you do what I did, and then you play the game, and then you forget to close it. You leave for a while, you come back, and then you look at your game, and it's literally running like a slideshow, which is exactly what happened here. I have no idea why. At least I didn't at the time. I didn't right up until the point I looked at the debugger and saw that it had 800 errors in it. Thank devs for the developer console, because immediately as soon as I opened it, I saw that some kind of a node was attempting to call a signal that was no longer defined in one of my scripts. And just through observing when the debugger would add another error to its log, and then observing what the heck is happening in the level, is when I realized that there's a couple of saw blades that are constantly going through an area node belonging to a laser. And from what it looked like, the laser wasn't programmed to adequately treat non-player collisions with the saw blade, and, well, it ended up reporting a signal that has been removed for a while from the project. What I don't understand is why did that cause performance issues? There's no new collisions being added, nothing is getting instanced. There's quite literally the same amount of resources as it had from the beginning of the level. Unless maybe when it attempts to run a signal, it does one report, but then it continues to try to run that signal or something. So when we were up to 800 calls, it would accumulate? I don't know, but the error was pretty apparent once you look at the debugger. Next up, I believe I had a moment to spare and I decided to put in some sort of a crumbling platform. The crumbling platform would detect when you stand on it, and as soon as you stand on it, it gives you an X amount of time before it crumbles away and destroys itself. Now, technically, this is something that could have also been achieved with that flipping platform had I, say, added some internal time tracking, where platform pops up, it detects when you stand on it, and after a certain amount of seconds or milliseconds, it retracts. So if I remember correctly, I think I chose to make this as a separate object because it looks like a crumbling piece of infrastructure, which would play more towards the environment and setting up the exposition of this whole location. And I suppose it would help set up the location a little bit better. Now, I did make this prop also respawn itself in case I needed something like that, although it doesn't make a lot of logical sense. Why would a platform just come back from it? You would usually reload the level and then all the challenges are back in place. But I don't know. I'm sure we'll find places where we can use this. This particular level technically reused a mechanic that we've already established in the past, which is the mechanic where plasma orbs are being spawned out of some sort of a hole in the wall or some sort of a dispenser. But in this particular case, we had a bit of a problem with continuous spawning of these plasma orbs. You see, beneath this level, there's a pit of death, but plasma orbs don't necessarily get destroyed. Not only that, the plasma orbs usually tend to spawn all the time. on a particular interval. And it doesn't really care if you are still carrying the existing plasma orb, it's just going to spawn new ones. So what I've done is established a little kill zone just beneath the camera range that will automatically destroy any plasma orbs that fall out of the level. And the core challenge of this level is there's a receptacle into which you put the plasma orbs. We've made this for the very first level in this early access segment of the game. And you're supposed to look at what kind of plasma orb it expects and deliver that kind of plasma orb into the receptacle. The issue is that the players could just sit there and hog the plasma orbs from one single receptacle and just kind of stash them and accumulate them in one location, and then go to the next one, do the same thing, grab a whole bunch, and then get to the receptacle and just start depositing stuff that they've collected. Which, considering that this level has a lot of components where the player has to try to parkour their way to stay in midair or stay mid-jump, there isn't really a piece of solid ground for them to stand on. They have to carefully jump over the tips of all these pillars. So allowing them to stash these plasma orbs wasn't exactly going to make this part very challenging. So what I've done is added a little bit of code to the plasma orb dispensers, which would effectively track if the plasma orb that they have collected is still existent. As long as the plasma orb that it has already dispensed still exists, it will not create a new one. I think I've also added a lifespan to the plasma orbs, meaning that they cannot exist forever. They will destroy themselves after a certain amount of time. So now you have this challenge where the player has to locate the proper spawner for the proper plasma orb, grab the plasma orb from that spawner, and then deliver it without destroying himself or the plasma orb to the receptacle. So from this point on, it was pretty much just me reusing these mechanics to build out these challenges. And this was before I decided to not record the whole level building process, because for a two-dimensional platformer like this is probably the most boring thing to watch someone do. There is quite literally virtually no programming involved in this. At this point, I would say this is actually the fun part. Like, it's boring to watch if you're a third party, but it's really fun to make if you're, you know, the developer. Because then you can start reusing all these systems in a way where you're thinking, oh yeah, this is gonna be such a pain in the ass. Can't wait to watch players try to go over it. Little did I know that what I was gonna try next was going to be such a pain in the ass to me. I decided to port over the project to Godot 4, which had proceeded to destroy all of the tiles that I have created up until that point. And I wanted to do it because there are certain additions to Godot 4 that I thought would be very useful for this project, primarily being the two-dimensional directional light. I thought that was a phenomenal addition. Like, the whole improvement to the lighting systems on both 2D and 3D front in Godot 4 are reasons alone for me to look at Godot 4 for a lot of my projects. Maybe not every project, but for a good number of them. As impressive and as awesome with the whole two-dimensional shadow systems already being implemented for you, the lighting system in 2D with all of its real-time shadows and smooth shadows and all that cool stuff was awesome. But in Godot 3, it was buggy as hell. Specifically, if you want to make some shadow-rich environments or lighting-rich environments, I found that once you add like 10 lights that have shadows on them, the performance goes off, which was such a disappointment, because that was one of the primary reasons why I switched the project over to Godot. The reason the lighting system was so messed up is because every single light essentially presented a separate surface within which all the shadows would be calculated, and then all of them would be combined in the post-process event. But in Godot 4, you have one single surface, apparently, from what I understand. All of the lights affect that one single surface, which means the performance savings for that approach are astronomical. That and the directional 2D light were pretty much reasons alone for me to transfer over to Godot 4. So I did what every good boy does and back up my project to Git and proceeded to port over the project, which has proceeded to destroy all of my tiles in all of my levels. And I don't mean they changed the tiles. I mean all the tiles were destroyed. Every single nook and cranny, every single platform, every single land of tile was gone. And it was at that point that a terrible thought had flashed in my mind. I'm never gonna finish this goddamn project, am I? I think by this point I had about 30-ish levels that I've put together following my daily morning routine. It was such a disappointment. I started recreating the very first level, and it took me a little while to get used to the whole, the new tile map system with the whole terrain spiel, and somehow they ended up making the terrain system worse. And I'm not the only one who thinks like this too. Somehow, the auto-tiler is shit now. And apparently, I think, it's currently being looked at and trying to be fixed. And there's a gentleman on YouTube who had created a script that you can attach to a tile map, or a plugin or a tool of some kind that fixes the behavior of the tile maps. And that video is at least, I think, 3 or 6 months old by now, which kind of begs the question, why haven't they implemented that into the core engine by this point? Like this, how do you screw up tiles? You had a perfectly functioning system in Godot 3, and now it takes some time to get the tiles in place, but you can still technically do it by hand. Oh yeah, and all the materials are gone from the 3D objects, all the export variable values went. And I noticed something which I think is really stupid. For some reason, Godot 4 will allow you to run your project even if you have an error in your code. Like a blatant error, like Godot says, hey, maybe want to take a look at this. There's a, this doesn't pan out really well, and I don't even have to run the project to know this, and it will still let you run the project. You know what's worse than that? If you run the project, and then it causes a crash, and there is an error report, when you close the game, it clears the error report. Why? What do you not realize that sometimes a program will freeze and you cannot actually close it? It's literally frozen. You can't even alt-tab into the program in the background. Sometimes you have a program that is always on top, and sometimes, even if it's not, it will just freeze in such a way that, well, you have to crash it, and as soon as you crash it, the freaking error gets cleared. Maybe it's some sort of a newfangled trend where professional programmers like to just make their own life difficult. But this is just one of those things that does not make sense. I pray this is something that you can toggle off in the settings, because most often than not, I will have music or voice recordings that will continue playing even if the game has crashed. And what I have to do now is listen to that nonsense while I'm trying to figure out what the error is. And especially because I'm recording the development process, this doesn't make for a very good recording. I would usually close the application and then look at the error. It just doesn't make sense. The last thing I have done for this project was do a recording session with the voice actress that I've mentioned earlier. She has come to be a very, very fine fit for the particular protagonist in the early access story. So I honestly can't wait enough to record more with her. She does such a phenomenal job doing voices for this project, and the recording rates are really affordable for like a no-budget project. So it's phenomenal work. Absolutely love what's coming out of it. This is it for the progress I made on the Artag Rise project. The process of porting over to Godot 4 has put me back quite a few steps, but hopefully it would be for a good cause and for great benefits in the long run, which I'm more than confident that's what the case is going to be. So I have a ton of vocal recordings that have been done with the voice actress, and between me and Tim voicing our own characters, hours of recording content, voiceover recordings that I need to go through. I need to chop them up. I need to find the best takes for all of them, do a little bit of post-processing, batch export them, insert them into the dialogue, and, well, put them in the game. It is a narrative game after all. So, that's it for this report. Holy crap, that took a while. I will try my best to do these reports more often so that they're not as lengthy and don't take up literally, like, this is day 3 of me recording it because schedules and just the sheer amount of energy it takes for me to record a report for one of these games. And this is like what, literally like 6 months of progress in one video. So yeah, you know, if anything, that should be a deterrent from procrastinating and not making these reports as often as I should. Cool. So thanks everybody for watching. Couple of notes. There's a Patreon link. It's somewhere, usually like in the link. If you want to support, it's not even going to be supporting me because I have a job. I'm looking to raise more money so I can hire more talent, so I can push these projects out of the way a lot better. In any case, if you've made it until the end of this video, holy crap. And also thank you. I appreciate your viewership. I'm going to try to make these updates a lot more often so they're a lot shorter and much more bite-sized. I'll see you guys in the next one, and have a good one.